Hello there, Vampire Diaries souls. Tonight, beneath the pale glow of a crescent moon hanging over Mystic Falls, Virginia, we return to a story older than the town itself. A story of ancient curses and impossible love. Of masks worn so long they become faces. Of ordinary people standing in the path of something vast and merciless and refusing to move. Season 2 begins with a shadow and ends with a sacrifice. So, settle in now. Close your eyes. Breathe slowly. And let the story carry you somewhere beautiful and dark and safe. The last thing John Gilbert remembered was his kitchen. He had been standing at the counter in the Gilbert house on the evening of May 22nd, 2009, when the girl he believed to be his daughter walked through the door. She had smiled at him with Elena's smile and moved toward him with Elena's ease. And John had felt nothing unusual, nothing wrong, because the resemblance was absolute and the deception was perfect. He had no way of knowing, in those final ordinary seconds, that the girl crossing his kitchen was not Elena Gilbert at all. Catherine Pierce moved through the world wearing Elena's face like a borrowed coat. She kissed John on the cheek with a tenderness that was entirely performance, and then she drove a knife into his abdomen with a precision that was entirely real. She worked quickly, methodically, the way someone works when they have done a thing many times before and feel nothing about doing it again. She took his fingers. She left him bleeding on the tile floor. And then she walked out of the kitchen and back into the warm Virginia evening, as if nothing of consequence had occurred. John Gilbert survived, which was not something Catherine had counted on. The Gilbert ring that Grayson and Miranda had passed down through their family carried a particular magic, one that protected its wearer from death at supernatural hands. John was wearing his ring. He would wake in a hospital bed, missing fingers, carrying the knowledge of what had found him in his own kitchen. But he would wake. Jeremy Gilbert was less fortunate in the short term. Catherine had gone upstairs in the Gilbert house and found Elena's younger brother in his room. Jeremy had been struggling since the accident at Wickery Bridge, since the deaths of his parents, since everything that had followed. He'd been drowning in grief and confusion and the particular despair of a teenager who could not find a reason to keep going. On the night Catherine visited, he had taken pills. Not enough to kill him, perhaps, but enough to make him slow, to soften the edges of the world, to make him vulnerable in ways he didn't understand, until it was too late. Catherine looked at Jeremy Gilbert and saw a message she wanted to send. She snapped his neck without ceremony and left him on his bedroom floor. Jeremy was wearing his own Gilbert ring. He woke several hours later, disoriented and nauseated and profoundly shaken, with the knowledge that something had broken his neck and chosen to leave him alive regardless. The experience planted a seed in him that would take time to grow into something darker, something the ring's repeated use would eventually water with consequences no one had anticipated. Damon Salvatore had kissed Catherine Pierce believing she was Elena. This was perhaps the wound that cut deepest in the immediate aftermath, not because it damaged his pride, though it did, but because of what it revealed about the century and a half of certainty he had carried. Damon had spent 145 years believing that Catherine Pierce was locked in a tomb beneath the old church on Fells Church Road, that she had been sealed there in 1864 during the night the founding families hunted and captured the vampires of Mystic Falls. He had believed she was waiting. He had believed, with the kind of faith that requires no evidence because it has become identity, that she had loved him, that her entombment had been tragedy rather than escape. She had not been in the tomb. She had never been in the tomb. Catherine had compelled one of the founding family members to ensure her freedom on the night of the vampire roundup, had walked out of Mystic Falls, while the man she had spent months playing against his brother sealed himself into a century and a half of devotion to a woman who had been gone before the smoke cleared. The kiss she had given Damon on the night of her return was not reunion. It was punctuation. It was Catherine reminding Damon, in the only language she was fluent in, that she had always been in control. Stefan understood this more clearly than Damon could in those first raw days. Stefan had loved Catherine too, had been transformed for her, had built the architecture of his supernatural existence around the events of 1864. But Stefan's feelings for Catherine had calcified into something closer to clarity over the decades. He knew what she was. He knew that her return to Mystic Falls was not sentiment. It was strategy. The question was what the strategy required. Elena moved through the immediate aftermath of Catherine's return with a particular kind of stillness that those who loved her had learned to recognize as the surface over something very deep and very cold. Someone had been wearing her face, moving through her life, touching the people she loved. Someone had kissed Damon using her mouth and stabbed her biological father using her hands and walked through her home with her gait and her hair and her eyes, and no one had known. She wrote in her journal about the violation of it, about how strange it felt to be robbed of something as fundamental as your own appearance, your own face, the specific arrangement of features you had been born with and grown into and never thought much about, because a face is simply a face until someone else claims it as a costume. But Elena's stillness was also practical. Catherine had come back for a reason, and until they understood the reason, they were all moving blind in a room full of sharp edges. The answer, or the beginning of it, was already lying in a hospital bed 1 floor below where Jeremy Gilbert had been admitted for observation following his resurrection. Caroline Forbes had not wanted to be in the hospital. She had not wanted any of this, had not asked for any part of the world she'd been dragged into since Helena had started dating Stefan Salvatore in the fall of her junior year. Caroline had spent most of that year feeling peripheral, overlooked, the friend who was always slightly less than, always the one the camera panned past on its way to someone more interesting. She had been compelled by Damon, used as a blood source, manipulated as a messenger. She had been, in the clinical language that the supernatural world would never use about itself, victimized repeatedly by something she didn't understand and couldn't fight. Catherine Pierce had decided Caroline Forbes was useful, She had found Caroline in the hospital, where Caroline had been admitted after an accident, and she had sat beside her bed with Eleanor's face arranged into Eleanor's concern. She had spoken kindly, she had leaned in close, and she had fed Caroline her blood, pressing her wrist to Caroline's mouth, ensuring that Catherine's vampire blood was in Caroline's system before anyone realized what had happened. Then Catherine had pressed a pillow over Caroline's face and held it there until Caroline Forbes stopped breathing. The transformation began the way all vampire transformations begin, with a specific cruelty that the mythology of vampirism never quite prepares you for. The vampire blood in Caroline's system did what vampire blood does when its host dies with it still present. It began to work. It kept her body from the full cessation that death requires, held her in the threshold state, the in-between, the place that is neither living nor dead, but demands a choice between the two. Caroline woke in the hospital morgue. She woke with every sensation amplified to a register she had no framework to understand. The fluorescent lights above her were not simply bright, but searing. Each individual frequency of light a separate assault. The smells of the hospital, antiseptic and metal, and the unmistakable copper salt warmth of human blood moving through human veins somewhere nearby, arrived with a clarity that made her head swim. She could hear heartbeats. Not one heartbeat, multiple heartbeats, each one distinct, each one accompanied by the soft percussion of blood moving through vessels, and her throat responded to that sound with a burning need she had no name for yet. She was in transition. She had 24 hours to make a choice that would define every hour after. Caroline Forbes drank from a blood bag she found in the morgue refrigerator. She completed her transition alone, in a cold room beneath a fluorescent light, before anyone knew she was awake. And when she walked out of the Mystic Falls Hospital into the morning, she was something she had not been when she walked in the previous day. Catherine, Pierce had sent a message with Caroline's transformation. The message was addressed to Stefan and Damon and Eleanor, and it read, in the language of action rather than words, "I can reach anyone. I can take anyone. And I did this not because I needed to, but because I wanted you to know that I could." The message was received. What Catherine had perhaps not anticipated was the particular way Caroline Forbes would receive it. Caroline did not collapse under the weight of what had been done to her. She did not spend weeks in denial or spiral into the self-destruction that the transformation could so easily become. She was terrified, yes. She was devastated and disoriented and furious in ways she didn't yet have language for. But beneath all of it, Caroline Forbes was deeply, congenitally unwilling to be someone else's aftermath. She would need help. She would need guidance. Someone who understood what she was facing and could teach her to navigate it. That help would come, and it would change the shape of her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But in those first hours, standing in the early morning light outside the hospital with blood on her mouth, and the world rearranged into something she barely recognized, Caroline made a decision that would define her entire supernatural existence. She was going to learn how to do this. She was going to master it. She was going to become the most controlled, most competent, most deliberately compassionate version of whatever she now was. Catherine Pierce had tried to make Caroline Forbes a weapon, a message, a casualty. Caroline Forbes had decided to become something else entirely. And in the Salvatore boarding house on the edge of town, in the old study lined with books that smelled of decades past, Damon poured himself a bourbon and stared at nothing in particular and tried to reckon with the arithmetic of the last 48 hours. Catherine was back. She had kissed him and walked away without explanation. She had turned Caroline and nearly killed John and snapped Jeremy's neck, and done all of it with the casual ease of someone tidying a room. She'd come back to Mystic Falls for something specific enough to require her presence, something she couldn't accomplish at a distance, something Damon was increasingly certain that had everything to do with Elena, with the doppelganger bloodline, with the ancient machinery that had been grinding toward this town for 500 years. Catherine Pierce did not do anything without reason. That is the first thing you learned about her, if you survived long enough to learn anything. Every move was calculated. Every cruelty served a purpose. She had returned to Mystic Falls not because she missed it, not because she felt anything as human as nostalgia or longing. She had returned because something here was necessary, and whatever it was, she intended to take it. Mystic Falls settled into an uneasy quiet as the night deepened around it, the town unaware of the ancient thing that had walked back into its borders, wearing a teenage girl's face and carrying 500 years of survival instinct wrapped in a smile that looked like love and felt like nothing at all. The game had begun again. The players were assembling, and somewhere in the darkness between the old houses and the older trees, Catherine Pierce was already 3 moves ahead, waiting with infinite patience for everyone else to catch up. The blood bag was cold. That was the first thing Caroline noticed about it, the temperature of it in her hands, the way the plastic felt slick and clinical, and nothing like the warmth that her body was telling her, with increasing urgency, that it needed. She was standing in the hospital morgue in the thin cotton of a patient gown, the fluorescent light humming above her at a frequency she could somehow now count, and she was holding a bag of stored blood from the refrigeration unit. She had opened on instinct before she fully understood what the instinct meant. She drank it anyway. She drank it because her throat was on fire and the burning had a specific direction to it, a specific want. And the bag in her hands was the answer to that want, whether she was ready to accept what that meant or not. The blood hit her system, and the burning eased. And in the quiet that followed, Caroline Forbes understood what had been done to her. She had been crying before she left the morgue. Not the soft, manageable tears of someone moved by something beautiful, but the ugly, desperate kind, the kind that comes when the thing you are crying about is too large to metabolize and your body simply runs it out through your eyes because there is nowhere else for it to go. She had been murdered. Catherine Pierce had pressed a pillow over her face and held it there, and Caroline had felt the specific horror of suffocation, the body's absolute refusal to accept what was happening, even as it lost the fight. And then she had felt nothing. And then she had woken up here. She was 17 years old, and she was a vampire, and she had not asked for either of those things to lead to this moment. Stefan found her before anyone else did. This was not coincidence. Stefan Salvatore had been alive for over 160 years, and he understood the particular urgency of a new vampire's first hours in ways that Damon, for all his experience, lacked the patience to address. He had been looking for Caroline from the moment Eleanor told him what Catherine had done, moving through the hospital with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this before, who knew what the transition looked like and what it required. He found her sitting on the steps outside the hospital's service entrance, the empty blood bag in her lap, her eyes very wide and very fixed on the middle distance. He sat down beside her without announcing himself, without the preamble of explanation or the performance of comfort. He simply sat, and he waited, and after a long moment, Caroline turned her head and looked at him with an expression that contained several years' worth of grief compressed into something small and exhausted. "Tell me how to do this," she said. Stefan told her. He was patient in a way that surprised her, given everything she thought she knew about the Salvatore brothers and the particular emotional temperatures they operated at. He explained the bloodlust in language that was clinical enough to be manageable, the burning in the throat, the way human blood would call to her from a distance she would gradually learn to estimate. The way emotion amplified the urge and control began with the breath, with the deliberate choice to slow down before the instinct accelerated. He explained compulsion, the ability to reach into a human mind and redirect its memory, smooth over the rough edges of an encounter that had gone wrong. He explained the daylight ring which Bonnie would make for her, which would allow her to exist in sunlight without the burning that would otherwise make daylight a torment. He told her the truth about what she was facing, which was that the first weeks were the hardest and that they would pass. He told her that control was not a destination, but a practice, something you built slowly and maintained daily, and that the worst thing a new vampire could do was believe that one bad moment defined everything that came after. Caroline listened to all of it with the focused attention of someone who has decided that competence is the only available response to catastrophe. The Mystic Falls Carnival arrived at the end of that first week with the particular bad timing that Mystic Falls seemed to specialize in, landing a major public event in the middle of Caroline's most dangerous period, with the cheerful indifference of a calendar that did not concern itself with supernatural crises. The carnival meant crowds, and crowds meant people, and people meant the smell of blood moving warmly through living veins at close quarters, and all of that together meant a test Caroline had not yet been asked to take. She went anyway. Staying home felt like surrender. The carnival grounds were strung with lights that seemed, to Caroline's new eyes, almost unbearably vivid. Each bulb a small sun throwing warm color across the faces of her classmates, who moved through the evening with the easy, unconscious pleasure of people who did not know that the girl handing out game tokens was managing a need they couldn't see. Caroline smiled. Caroline laughed at the right moments. Caroline performed normalcy with a precision that she was beginning to understand was itself a kind of vampire skill, the ability to be present in a human space without disturbing the surface of it. And then she smelled Carter. Carter was a carnival worker, young and friendly, setting up one of the ring toss booths with the unhurried ease of someone who had done the job at 100 carnivals in 100 small towns. He had a cut on his hand, small and already clotting, Nothing that would have registered to anyone around him as significant. To Caroline, it arrived like a sound in a silent room, specific and insistent and impossible to unhear. She moved away from him. She found a quieter corner of the grounds and pressed her back against a support pole and breathed through it, counting the way Stefan had shown her, reminding herself of what she was and what she had decided she would be. She held the line. Tyler Lockwood found her in that corner, which was not a help. Tyler had been circling the edges of the carnival with the particular restless energy that had been building in him for weeks. Something underneath his skin that made him short-tempered and distracted and prone to sudden flashes of aggression that he couldn't entirely explain or control. He didn't know yet what was coming for him. He knew only that he felt wrong in his own body, that the wrongness had a specific character to it, and that being around people was making it worse tonight, rather than better. He said something sharp to Caroline, the kind of careless cruelty that Tyler had always been capable of when he was uncomfortable and didn't know what to do with the discomfort. Caroline said something sharp back. The exchange escalated in the way that arguments escalate when both people involved are operating at the edge of their own capacity, and Tyler grabbed her wrist, and the physical contact was a thing that broke Caroline's careful management of the evening. She didn't hurt Tyler. She stopped herself from hurting Tyler, which was a different thing and a harder one. But in the movement away from him, in the urgency of removing herself from a situation she could feel slipping, she crossed Carter's path again. She didn't mean for it to happen. She had not planned it, and she had not wanted it. And in the years that followed, she would return to that moment with a grief that never entirely diminished. The bloodlust found the opening before her conscious control could close it. And Carter was on the ground before Caroline had fully registered what she was doing. She came back to herself seconds later, kneeling beside him. And what she felt in that moment was not the satisfaction that the bloodlust had promised, but something far worse and far more lasting. Horror, guilt, the specific settling weight of having become the thing she had told herself she would never be. Stefan was there within minutes, compelled Carter to forget, ensured the young man would recover. Carter lived. The evening closed over the incident like water over a stone. But Caroline carried it, would always carry it, the knowledge of what she was capable of in the space between intention and instinct. She told Stefan she wanted to stake herself. She said it plainly, without drama, standing in the shadow of the carnival's main tent, while the light strung overhead threw patterns across the ground. She said it as a logical conclusion she had reached, the way someone might present a solution to a problem, because in that moment it felt like the only honest response to what she had just learned about herself. Stefan took her hands in both of his, and he said no. He said it with the authority of someone who had stood at the same conclusion and chosen differently, who had lived through 160 years of the same war between what you were capable of and what you chose to do with that capability. He said it with the gentleness of someone who understood that self-destruction was not the same as accountability, and that the difference between them mattered enormously. "You stopped," Stefan told her. "You came back. That matters more than what happened in between." Caroline did not entirely believe him, but she allowed herself that night to choose to continue, The nights that followed were structured around practice. Stefan was patient and consistent in a way that Caroline began to depend on without quite admitting it. Showing up at the Forbes house in the evenings with blood bags he'd sourced from the hospital blood bank. Working through exercises in control. Talking through the theory of it. Sitting with her through the harder hours when the amplified emotions that came with her new nature were too loud to think around. Liz Forbes, Caroline's mother and the town sheriff, had been told her daughter was sick, a story that required ongoing maintenance and careful management. Caroline and Matt continued their fragile relationship across the fault line of her secret. Matt Donovan loved Caroline with a steady, uncomplicated devotion that was simply his nature. A boy who had grown up without much and held tightly to the things that felt real. He could feel her changing, could feel the places where she was absent from conversations she was present in, could sense the thing she wasn't telling him the way you can sense a closed door in a room you thought you knew completely. Caroline held the secret close and watched him feel the distance of it and understood that this was the cost. That intimacy and concealment could not sustainably occupy the same space. Across town, Tyler Lockwood was beginning to understand what the restlessness in his bones meant. His uncle Mason had arrived in Mystic Falls carrying his own secret, wearing it more comfortably than Tyler wore his discomfort. And the two of them circled each other with the wary recognition of people who share something that doesn't have ordinary words. The supernatural world of Mystic Falls was rearranging itself around new facts. A new vampire who refused to be a casualty, a werewolf bloodline about to awaken, and somewhere in the architecture of all of it, a moonstone and a curse, and an ancient obligation that had been patient for 500 years and was not inclined to wait much longer. Caroline Forbes stood in her bedroom mirror on the morning of her second week as a vampire and practiced her smile. She was testing it, checking its edges, making sure it reached her eyes in the way that human smiles did, that it contained the warmth and ease that people expected from her. It did. She was good at this. She had always been good at performance, had always understood instinctively the relationship between the face you showed the world and the work required to maintain it. The difference now was that the thing behind the performance was something she was only beginning to understand, something vast and frightening, and also she was slowly and reluctantly starting to admit, something that was entirely her own. She was a vampire. She had not chosen it, and she had not wanted it, and the person who had done it to her had meant it as destruction. But Caroline Forbes was not going to be destroyed. She had decided. Mason Lockwood arrived in Mystic Falls the way trouble usually arrived in that town, quietly and with a plausible reason. He came for the funeral. Richard Lockwood, Tyler's father and Mason's older brother, had died during the events of the Founders' Day celebration. Caught in the Gilbert device's frequency alongside the vampires it had been designed to neutralize. The device had targeted anyone with a supernatural frequency, and Richard Lockwood had apparently carried one. A fact that raised questions about the Lockwood family that no one in Mystic Falls had thought to ask before. Mason came to bury his brother and to be present for his sister-in-law Carol and his nephew Tyler. And if those were not his only reasons for returning, he wore the grief convincingly enough. that the other reasons stayed hidden for a while. He was not what anyone expected. Mason Lockwood was warm where the town had braced for cold, easy where it had anticipated difficulty. He was the kind of man who filled a room without demanding it, who made conversation feel effortless, who wore his physicality with the relaxed confidence of someone entirely comfortable inside his own body. Tyler, who had been circling the edges of his own grief and confusion for weeks, responded to his uncle with something close to relief. Here was a man who seemed to understand him without requiring explanation, who didn't flinch at Tyler's anger or try to manage it into something more socially convenient. Mason understood Tyler because Mason had been Tyler once. He knew exactly what was building beneath his nephew's skin because he had felt it build in his own. Years earlier, in a moment on a beach in Florida that had divided his life as cleanly as a blade, the werewolf curse ran through the Lockwood bloodline the way certain traits run through families, present in the genetics, dormant until activated. The activation required a specific trigger, one that the curse had built into itself with the particular cruelty of ancient magic that understood human nature well enough to know how to find it. The curse activated when its carrier took a human life. Not accidentally, not in self-defense, but in a moment of violence where the intention and the outcome aligned in a way that the magic recognized and claimed. Mason had killed someone in a fight, a friend, which made it worse, a man named Jimmy, whose death had been the result of a confrontation that escalated past the point where Mason could pull it back, his own strength betraying him in a moment of anger he had not fully understood. Jimmy had died. Mason had transformed for the first time the following full moon, alone and unprepared. In agony he had no framework for, and the person who came back from that night was different from the one who had gone in. He had learned to manage it. He had spent years building the discipline that the monthly transformation required, had found ways to make his life work around the cycle, had become someone who understood the supernatural world well enough to move through it without being destroyed by it. He had also learned about the moonstone. The moonstone was small enough to hold in a closed fist, dark and smooth, its surface carrying the faint iridescence of something that had been touched by old magic and retained the impression of it. It had been in the Lockwood family for generations, passed down through the bloodline without full explanation, its purpose obscured by time and the particular human tendency to stop asking questions about things that have always simply been present. Mason knew what it was for, or believed he did. He had been told by someone he trusted that the moonstone was the key to breaking the werewolf curse, that with it in hand a witch of sufficient power could perform a ritual that would free werewolves from the compulsion of the full moon, allow them to choose their transformations rather than endure them, give back the autonomy that the curse had stripped from every Lockwood who had ever carried it. He had come to Mystic Falls to find it. The moonstone had been hidden somewhere on Lockwood property, concealed at some point in the family's history by someone who understood its value well enough to want it protected. Mason searched methodically, moving through the property with the patience of someone who had been looking for a long time and had learned not to mistake urgency for speed. Catherine Pierce found him before he found the stone. Their first meeting had the quality of two people recognizing in each other something that most people couldn't see. The particular awareness of someone who's been navigating a dangerous world for long enough to develop instincts that operate faster than conscious thought. Catherine was beautiful in the way that had always been useful to her. The kind of beauty that arrived in a room before she did and rearranged the air. She introduced herself as a woman passing through Mystic Falls, interested in its history, curious about the old families. She smiled at Mason with Elena's face and 500 years of practice behind it. Mason knew she was a vampire. Catherine knew he was a werewolf. They circled each other with the wary appreciation of natural predators sharing territory. And then Catherine told him a version of the truth about the moonstone that was close enough to be credible and shaped carefully enough to serve her purposes. She told him she wanted to break the curse too. She told him that the moonstone was the key, that she knew a witch who could perform the ritual, that their interests were aligned, and their combined resources would be enough to accomplish what neither could alone. She was persuasive the way she was always persuasive, which was to say completely, offering Mason exactly the story he wanted to hear, in exactly the register that made it feel like discovery rather than manipulation. Mason began meeting Catherine in secret. He believed he was using her as much as she was using him, which was exactly what Catherine needed him to believe. Damon noticed. Damon's suspicion of Mason Lockwood had begun at the Lockwood estate during a gathering of the town's founding families, where the two of them had occupied the same space with the mutual wariness of people who recognized each other's nature without yet having confirmed it. Damon tested his theory at a swimming hole outside of town, provoking a confrontation that escalated with deliberate intent, watching Mason's response to physical threat with the clinical attention of someone running an experiment. Mason's reaction, the speed and force of it, the way his eyes changed in the moment before he controlled himself, was confirmation enough. Damon told Stefan. Stefan counseled patience, the gathering of information before action, the disciplined approach that Damon found constitutionally difficult to maintain when a werewolf with unknown intentions was operating freely in a town that already had more supernatural complications than it could comfortably manage. Damon's version of patience lasted approximately 1 week. He poisoned Mason's drink at the Lockwood estate with wolfsbane, which was to werewolves what vervain was to vampires, a botanical irritant that caused pain and sickness without killing. Mason's reaction to the poisoning was immediate and severe, sending him outside in visible distress, confirming both his nature and the wolfsbane's efficacy. It also confirmed something else, something that recalibrated Damon's assessment of the threat level. Mason recovered, quickly, more quickly than the dose should have allowed, his werewolf healing undoing the damage at a rate that suggested a resilience that vampires needed to account for. Stefan was not pleased about the poisoning. The argument that followed had the shape of many arguments between the Salvatore brothers, Damon's aggressive pragmatism grinding against Stefan's measured caution, each of them right about different things and wrong about the same ones. Stefan understood that antagonizing Mason before they understood his full purpose was strategically reckless. Damon understood that leaving a werewolf in Catherine Pierce's orbit without interference was a different kind of recklessness, one with potentially larger consequences. Elena listened to both of them and felt the familiar weight of being the person at the center of a situation she had not chosen. Watching the people around her calculate risk and strategy in relation to her survival the way generals calculate terrain. Mason found the moonstone in the old Lockwood well. It had been there for generations, sealed in a bag weighted with stones, submerged in dark water at the bottom of a structure that the family had stopped using decades before and mostly forgotten. He reached into the cold water and closed his hand around it and felt the magic in it, faint and old and resonant. Like a bell that had been struck so long ago, the sound had become indistinguishable from silence, but was still technically present. He brought it to Catherine that same night. This was the moment where Mason Lockwood's story in Mystic Falls reached its conclusion, though he didn't know it yet. Damon captured him. The specifics were efficient and unpleasant, and entirely in keeping with Damon's approach to problems that had stopped being theoretical. He wanted to know what Catherine had told Mason, what the moonstone was for, what the full shape of the plan looked like from Mason's vantage point. Mason told him some of it, under duress, enough for Damon to understand that the moonstone was connected to something larger than a single werewolf's desire for freedom from the full moon's obligation. Then Damon killed him. He did it without the extended moral negotiation that Stefan would have required, without the lengthy internal deliberation that Eleanor would have brought to the decision. He did it because Mason Lockwood was a werewolf working for Catherine Pierce, in a town where the stakes were already too high and the complications already too numerous, and because Damon's calculus of protection, however brutal its methods, had a coherent internal logic. The message he sent Catherine was immediate and unambiguous. He called her and told her what he had done. He told her Mason was gone, and whatever she had been planning with him was finished. He told her she had underestimated him, which was something he was tired of people doing. Catherine's response was silence, and then a laugh that contained nothing resembling grief. Mason Lockwood had served his purpose. The moonstone was in her possession. Whatever she felt about the man's death, if she felt anything, it was not the loss of someone who had mattered to her. It was the minor inconvenience of a tool that no longer needed returning to its drawer. Eleanor heard about Mason's death and felt the particular exhaustion that came from living in a world where the violence was always proximate, always connected to her, always leaving bodies in its wake, that she had to find a way to grieve for people she was not quite sure she was allowed to grieve. Mason had been working with Catherine, had been part of a plan that endangered the people she loved, and he had also been Tyler's uncle, the man Tyler had looked at with relief and recognition, the one anchor in a storm that was about to get significantly worse. She thought about how she would tell Tyler. She thought about the moonstone, sitting somewhere in Catherine's possession now, its purpose still not entirely clear, its connection to the larger machinery of the curse only partially visible from where Elena stood. The pieces were assembling themselves with the patient inevitability of a puzzle that had been in progress for 500 years. The moonstone was one of them. Eleanor herself was another. and somewhere beyond the edges of what any of them could yet see, the picture those pieces were forming was coming slowly, terribly into focus. The trigger came at a party. It happened the way the worst things in Mystic Falls tended to happen, not in the middle of a confrontation anyone had braced for, but sideways, in the gap between one ordinary moment and the next. There was a girl named Sarah, a classmate, and there was an argument that escalated past the point where Tyler could pull it back, and there was a staircase. And then there was Sarah at the bottom of it, not moving, and the silence that followed was the kind that changes the shape of everything that comes after. Sarah survived. But in the moment before Tyler knew that, in the seconds between her falling and the confirmation of her pulse, the werewolf curse found what it had been waiting for. The intention had been there, brief and hot and uncontrolled, and the magic did not require the outcome to complete its claim. It required only the moment, the specific convergence of rage and consequence that the curse had been designed to recognize. The curse recognized it. Tyler stood at the bottom of that staircase and felt something shift in the architecture of his body. Something deep and fundamental, like a lock turning in a door he hadn't known was there. He didn't understand what had happened yet. He understood only that something had changed, that the wrongness he had been carrying for weeks had crossed some kind of threshold, and that whatever was coming next was going to be worse than anything he had imagined. He went to Caroline. This was not, on its surface, an obvious choice. Caroline Forbes and Tyler Lockwood had been occupying the same social spaces since elementary school, without ever developing the kind of friendship that invited genuine confidence. They had been friendly in the way that people are friendly when they share a town and a school and a loose network of mutual acquaintances, cordial and occasionally warm, but never close. Never the people either of them would have thought to call in a crisis. But Tyler had watched Caroline change in the weeks since school started, had noticed the things that didn't add up, the speed and the strength and the careful management of herself in situations that should have been ordinary. He had his own secret now, enormous and terrifying and pressing against the inside of his chest with a force that made ordinary conversation feel like performance, and he needed to give it to someone who could hold it without breaking. He told her what he was. Caroline listened with the focused stillness of someone who understood exactly what it cost to say a thing like that out loud for the first time. Then she told him what she was. The exchange had the quality of two people setting down very heavy things they had been carrying alone and discovering that the ground held both weights without complaint. She researched what he was facing. She went through Stefan's journals, through the Salvatore library, through every source available to her, because Caroline's response to fear had always been information. The belief that understanding a thing gave you some purchase on it, even when it didn't give you control. What she found about the first transformation was not reassuring. Mason had left something behind in the Lockwood house before his death. A video recorded on a handheld camera in the shaky, intimate style of someone documenting something they were not sure they would survive, addressed to Tyler in the event that Mason was not around to explain it in person. Tyler watched it alone the first time, and then he watched it with Caroline, and the specific quality of Mason's voice on that recording The careful honesty of a man trying to prepare his nephew for something he could not protect him from made the reality of what was coming land in a way that all the research had not quite managed. The first transformation would take hours. It would begin with fever and disorientation and escalate through stages of pain that Mason described with the restraint of someone who did not want to traumatize, but also could not in good conscience minimize. The bones would reshape. The body would remake itself into something other than human with a thoroughness that left nothing unchanged. And throughout it, the mind would remain present, aware, unable to retreat from the experience into unconsciousness, because the curse did not permit that mercy. They planned carefully, which was all they could do. The old Lockwood cellar beneath the estate was the most secure location available. Stone walls and a heavy door, and sufficient distance from the main house that sound would not carry. Caroline brought chains, thick ones, the kind that her vampire strength could manage, even if Tyler's transformed state exceeded what ordinary restraints could hold. Tyler brought the video and the grim, set expression of someone who has decided that the only way through a thing is through it. The night of the full moon arrived with the indifference that natural phenomena brought to human crises. The moon rising full and bright over Mystic Falls without acknowledgement of what its light was about to do to the boy standing in a stone cellar 40 feet underground. It started with the fever. Tyler sat against the wall of the cellar with the chains loose around his wrists and the sweat already starting at his temples, and he was still himself. Still the boy who had thrown footballs in autumn light and argued with his father and carried his grief about Mason's death in the specific compressed way that teenage boys carried grief they had no language for. He was still Tyler. And then, incrementally, he began to be something else as well. Caroline stayed. This was the thing about Caroline Forbes in that cellar on that night. The thing that mattered more than the research or the chains or the careful preparation. She stayed when the fever spiked and Tyler's voice changed and the sounds he made stopped being the sounds a human throat produced. She stayed when the first bones began to shift, when Tyler's spine arched against his will and a scream tore out of him that had nothing of the boy she knew in it. When his eyes changed color and his hands began to reshape themselves around the chains that were the only thing between his transformation and whatever it might do to her. She pressed herself against the far wall and she stayed. The transformation took 4 hours. This was not unusually long for a first transformation, which was perhaps the most terrible thing about that fact. It simply took that long. There was no shortcut, no point at which the body completed its work and allowed relief. It was continuous, the remaking of a human body into something else. And then, when the night was sufficient, the remaking of it back again, each direction as costly as the other. Wolf Tyler did not know Caroline. This was the thing she had been warned about and had understood intellectually, but had not fully absorbed until the moment the wolf turned its attention to her, and she saw in its eyes absolutely no recognition, no trace of the boy who had come to her for help, nothing that remembered that she was a friend. It was all instinct, and it was all predator, and the instinct told it that the thing pressed against the far wall was prey. It came for her. The chains held for longer than she had expected, and less long than she had hoped, and when they gave, she moved with the speed that her vampire nature provided, staying ahead of it, absorbing the impact when she couldn't avoid it, protecting herself while also trying not to harm the animal that contained her friend. A werewolf bite was lethal to vampires. She knew this, and the knowledge made every near miss in that cellar carry a weight that the physical danger alone would not have. She survived the night. Tyler survived the night. Dawn came through the gaps in the cellar door as thin grey light, and the wolf stilled, and the process ran itself in reverse, and Tyler Lockwood came back to himself on the stone floor of his family cellar, human and naked and shaking with the accumulated cost of what his body had been through. He was bleeding in places. His muscles had the specific failure of tissue that had been pushed far past its tolerances and had not yet begun to recover. Caroline was sitting 3 feet away, her back against the wall, her knees drawn up, watching him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. It was not pity. Caroline Forbes did not do pity, had never done pity, had reorganized her entire emotional vocabulary when she became a vampire, and removed pity from it entirely on the grounds that it diminished the person it was directed at. What she was looking at him with was something closer to recognition, the specific understanding of someone who knew what it felt like to become something you hadn't chosen and to survive the first night of it. Tyler looked at his hands. They were his hands again, familiar and human-shaped. The knuckles scraped raw from the stone floor. He turned them over and looked at the palms and felt the full weight of what the night had held, and something in him cracked open in a way that he didn't try to prevent. He wept. He wept with the completeness of someone who had been holding something enormous for a very long time and had finally reached a place where setting it down was possible. Caroline did not move toward him immediately, and she did not look away. She gave him the thing he actually needed, which was the space to fall apart without an audience that needed him to be okay. Then she moved to sit beside him, close enough that the contact was available without being imposed, and she stayed there while the morning came in through the gaps in the door, and the full moon retreated, and Mystic Falls went about its ordinary business above them, entirely unaware of what had happened beneath it. Tyler said he was sorry for almost killing her. His voice was wrecked and rough, and the apology had the quality of something he understood was insufficient, but was all he had. Caroline told him that almost didn't count. She meant it as a practical statement, which was how she had learned to hold difficult truths since becoming a vampire. Almost was not the same as actually. He had not killed her. She had not let him. They had both made it through the night, which was the only metric that mattered in the immediate aftermath. What grew between them in that cellar, in the long quiet of that morning, was not romantic, not yet, not exactly. It was something that preceded romance and was in some ways more durable. The specific bond that forms between people who have witnessed each other at the most unguarded and undefended version of themselves and chosen to stay anyway. Tyler had watched Caroline manage her bloodlust and her grief and her terror with a steadiness he had not expected. Caroline had watched Tyler lose himself entirely and come back, had stayed in the room while he was something that wanted to kill her. They knew each other now in a way that none of their other relationships had managed. Tyler could not tell his mother, could not tell Matt, could not bring the truth of what he was into, the ordinary daylight spaces of his life, without changing them beyond recovery. The isolation of that had a specific texture to it, the loneliness of a secret that was too large and too strange for the containers that ordinary life provided. But he was not entirely alone. And in the particular darkness that the werewolf curse had placed around Tyler Lockwood's life, that one fact was not nothing. It was, for now, enough to continue. The vampires from the tomb had not left Mystic Falls. This was the fact that settled over the town in the weeks following the Founders' Day disaster like a second weather system, present and dangerous and largely invisible to anyone who didn't know to look for it. 27 vampires had been entombed beneath the old church on Fells Church Road in 1864, sealed there by Emily Bennett's spell at the request of the founding families, who had wanted them contained rather than destroyed. The spell had been broken at the end of the previous year. The tomb had opened, and the vampires, who had spent 145 years in desiccated suspension, had walked out into a world that had changed beyond recognition, while they had not changed at all. Most of them were angry. This was perhaps understandable given the circumstances of their entombment. But understanding a thing did not make it less dangerous. They had been betrayed by the town that had promised them protection, sealed away by the families whose names still appeared on the buildings and the streets of the Mystic Falls they had woken into. The anger had the particular character of grievances that had been sitting undisturbed for over a century, concentrated and absolute. They fed without the discretion that the Salvatore brothers had spent decades cultivating. They moved through the edges of Mystic Falls and the surrounding area with the blunt need of creatures who had been starved for a very long time, and the body count that accumulated in their wake was the kind of problem that the town's vampire-aware council tried to contain before it became the kind of problem that attracted attention from outside. Eleanor was aware of them the way she was aware of most of the dangers that surrounded her life now, as a persistent background condition that required monitoring but had not yet resolved into a specific threat directed at her. She had enough specific threats. The tomb vampires were a general one, part of the landscape of a town that had more supernatural activity per square mile than any place had a reasonable right to expect. What she did not yet know was that the network of older, more powerful vampires operating in the world beyond Mystic Falls had already taken notice of her existence. Slater was a vampire who collected academic degrees the way some people collected stamps, enrolled in universities across the decades, accumulating credentials with the patient thoroughness of someone for whom time was not a limiting factor. He operated as a kind of broker in certain supernatural circles, a connector of people and information, and he had connections that ran deeper and older than anything currently visible in Mystic Falls. Through Slater, and through the network he represented, the name Eleanor Gilbert had begun to travel in directions she was not aware of. The name that came back along those same channels was Elijah. Rose and Trevor had been running for 500 years. This was not hyperbole. 500 years was the precise duration of their flight, begun in 1513, when a young Bulgarian girl named Katerina Petrova had escaped her fate as Klaus's sacrificial doppelganger with their assistance, and the consequences of that assistance had never stopped arriving. Trevor had helped Katerina out of sympathy, out of the impulsive compassion that had always been his defining quality and his greatest liability. Rose had helped Trevor because Rose had always helped Trevor, because their bond across the centuries was the kind that formed when two people survived enough together that survival itself became the relationship. Klaus did not forgive. This was perhaps the single most important fact about the original hybrid, the one that made him categorically different from every other supernatural threat in the known world. He did not tire of a grudge. He did not redirect his attention and allow old scores to go unsettled. He had been hunting Rose and Trevor for 500 years with the patient. Absolute certainty of someone who understood that immortality meant every debt was eventually collectible. Rose had grown exhausted in a way that 5 centuries of life had not prepared her for. Not physically exhausted, the body's fatigue was a manageable thing, but the deeper exhaustion of perpetual flight, of never stopping long enough to build anything, of existing in a permanent state of provisional safety that could dissolve without warning. She wanted it to end. She wanted to find a way to make it end that did not involve Klaus finding them in some unremarkable location and ending it for her. The doppelganger was that way. The logic was straightforward, if brutal. Klaus needed the doppelganger to break his curse. The doppelganger was therefore the most valuable thing in the world to him. Delivering the doppelganger to Klaus, or more precisely to Elijah, who acted as intermediary and who had his own relationship with his brother's agenda, might purchase something. Forgiveness was too much to hope for after 500 years. But perhaps safety, perhaps an end to the running. They took Elena from the Salvatore house on a night when the autumn dark came early and the fog sat low over the roads out of town. The abduction was efficient, Trevor's speed and Rose's experience combining to remove Elena from her environment before the alarm could be raised, and they drove through the darkness to an abandoned estate outside the city, a crumbling building that smelled of old wood and damp stone, and the particular staleness of a place that had been empty long enough to forget what occupancy felt like. Elena processed her situation with the practicality she had developed over months of living adjacent to supernatural crisis. She was afraid, genuinely and appropriately afraid, but fear had stopped being paralyzing and had become something she operated alongside, a condition rather than a state. She talked to Rose and Trevor. She asked questions. She had learned that information was the only resource consistently available to her in situations where physical power was not an option. Trevor paced. He had the restless energy of someone who had made a decision and was now living in the gap between commitment and consequence, waiting to see which version of the future his choice would deliver. He had liked Katerina. All those centuries ago, he had looked at a frightened girl facing death and chosen the human response over the pragmatic one, and the 500 years since had been the cost of that choice, paid in installments that had never stopped coming due. Elijah arrived before dawn. The thing about Elijah Mickelson that hit you first was not his power, though the power was immense and immediately legible to anyone with sufficient supernatural awareness to read it. It was the manner. He moved through the doorway of the abandoned estate with the unhurried composure of someone who had never once in 1,000 years needed to hurry, who understood that the world arranged itself around his intentions rather than the other way around. He wore his authority the way old buildings wore their architecture, as something structural rather than decorative. He looked at Trevor with an expression that contained something almost like regret. Almost. Trevor died quickly. This was perhaps the only mercy Elijah offered in that room, the efficiency of it, the refusal to extend the punishment beyond its necessary duration. He moved with the speed that original vampires possessed, and the strength that 1,000 years of existence had compounded. And Trevor was gone before Rose's sound of grief had fully formed, before the reality of it had time to arrange itself into something anyone in the room could respond to. Rose's grief was the kind that had nowhere to go. 500 years of companionship, of shared survival, of the particular intimacy that formed between people who had no one else, ended in a second in a crumbling room in the dark, and Rose stood very still in the aftermath of it, with her hands at her sides and her face doing something complicated that Elijah did not look at and Eleanor could not look away from. Elijah turned his attention to Eleanor with the particular focus of someone examining something they have heard a great deal about and are now forming their own assessment of. He looked at her the way scholars looked at primary sources, with interest and rigor and the suspension of prior conclusions pending direct evidence. Elena looked back at him steadily. She told him she knew about the sacrifice. She told him she knew about the curse and the doppelganger bloodline and what her blood was meant to do. She had been accumulating this knowledge for months, and she deployed it now as the only available demonstration of competence. The evidence that she was not simply a passive object to be delivered, but a person with understanding of her own situation. Elijah was interested. He had expected terror, or perhaps the performance of courage over terror, which was the more common presentation. He had not expected this. The genuine steadiness of a 17-year-old girl who had looked at the full shape of what was coming for her and was still standing upright. He released her. He freed Rose from her obligation as well, the debt of 500 years discharged in a single gesture that contained more pragmatism than mercy. Rose had delivered the doppelganger. The terms were satisfied. Stefan and Damon arrived in the aftermath of the rescue with the specific fury of people who had been frightened and were expressing it as aggression. Damon staked Elijah with a white oak ash dagger, driving it into his chest with the force of someone who did not intend to leave the outcome in question. Elijah collapsed. The body did not move. They took Eleanor home. Rose came with them because she had nowhere else to go, and because Eleanor had asked her to come with a directness that Rose, still absorbing the loss of Trevor in the stunned quiet that followed acute grief, did not have the resources to refuse. She knew things about the original vampires and the world they operated in that the Salvatore brothers needed. She was willing to share that knowledge in exchange for the simple and not inconsiderable benefit of not being alone. In the days that followed, Rose filled in the outlines of what was coming. She told them about Klaus with the specificity of someone who had spent 5 centuries learning everything available to know about the thing hunting her, building the profile of a predator from a distance because proximity was never survivable. She told them about the original family, about the curse, about the ritual's requirements, about the absolute impossibility of standing between Klaus and something he had decided to take. The name settled over the Salvatore boarding house like weather. Klaus. It was a short name for something so large. It had the quality of words that accumulated weight through repetition and consequence, that meant more each time they were spoken, because each time they were spoken, the speaking was by someone who understood more than they had before about what the name contained. Elena sat with the knowledge of it and understood that the season of maneuvering and revelation was drawing towards something. The pieces had been assembling since Catherine's return, each new complication adding to the architecture of an endgame she could see the shape of now without yet being able to see the details. Klaus was coming, the sacrifice was coming, and everything happening in Mystic Falls, every alliance and betrayal and desperate plan, was moving in relation to that fixed point on the horizon, whether the people making those plans admitted it or not. Elijah Mikhaelson did not stay dead. This was the first and most important lesson the Salvatore brothers learned about original vampires, delivered with the quiet efficiency of a fact that rearranged everything built around the assumption it contradicted. The white oak ash dagger Damon had driven into Elijah's chest had not destroyed him. It had neutralized him, held him in a suspension that resembled death closely enough to be mistaken for it. But the moment the dagger was removed, the moment the ash was no longer present in the wound, the body on the floor of the Salvatore basement drew breath, and the eyes opened, and Elijah Mikhaelson returned to the world with the composure of someone waking from an afternoon rest. He had been in that basement for weeks before anyone removed the dagger. The discovery that he had survived at all came through channels that made the revelation more unsettling than it might otherwise have been, arriving not as a threat from outside, but as a presence that had been inside the house the entire time, contained but not destroyed, waiting with the patience of someone for whom waiting was not a hardship. Elena removed the dagger. She did this alone, without telling Stefan or Damon, which was a decision that contained everything essential about where Elena Gilbert was at this point in her story. She had spent months being protected, hidden, moved between locations, surrounded by people making decisions about her safety with the best intentions and without her input, and the accumulated weight of that passivity had become something she was no longer willing to carry. She understood the risk. She had assessed it and decided that the alternative, continuing to be managed rather than consulted about her own fate, was a different kind of risk, one that operated more slowly but with equal damage. She needed to talk to Elijah directly, without Stefan's protectiveness shaping the conversation, without Damon's aggression determining its temperature. Elijah, for his part, received this gesture with the equanimity of someone who had encountered most varieties of human behavior across 1,000 years and had stopped being surprised by any of them. He sat across from Elena in the Salvatore parlor and he listened. And the listening was genuine, the kind that came from actual interest rather than the performance of it. Elena told him she knew about the sacrifice. She told him she knew about Klaus, about the moonstone, about the doppelganger bloodline, and the ritual's requirements. She told him she was not going to run, which was perhaps the thing that landed with the most weight in that room, because running was what the last doppelganger had done. and the 500 years since had been the consequence of that choice, paid by everyone in reach. She told him she wanted a deal. Elijah listened to the terms she proposed with the careful attention of someone evaluating a document, looking for the places where the logic held and the places where it didn't. Elena was asking for the protection of the people she loved. She was asking for a guarantee that they would survive the sacrifice, that Klaus's ritual would not require their deaths as collateral. She was asking, in essence, for Elijah to stand between Klaus and everyone Elena cared about, and to hold that position regardless of what it cost him. In exchange, she would cooperate. She would not run, would not hide, would not require the expenditure of supernatural resources to locate or contain her. She would walk into the sacrifice of her own volition, as Katerina Petrova had refused to do, and she would trust Elijah's word that the death the ritual required was not the permanent kind, that with the right magic and the right preparation, she could die and return. Elijah agreed. He gave his word with the formality of someone who understood that a word given by an original vampire carried a specific weight, that the currency of it had been established across 1,000 years of keeping or breaking promises, and that his particular history with the former made the latter something he was not inclined toward. Stefan's reaction when he found out was the controlled fury of someone who had learned to contain his emotions across 160 years and was currently failing at it. He understood Elena's reasoning. He could follow the logic from premise to conclusion without losing the thread. What he could not accept was the conclusion itself. The idea of Elena choosing to walk toward the sacrifice rather than away from it, choosing to trust an original vampire's word over the combined protective instincts of everyone who loved her. Damon's reaction was less controlled and more honest. He told her it was the most reckless thing she had ever done, which in the context of Elena's recent history was a meaningful statement. He told her that trusting Elijah was functionally indistinguishable from trusting Klaus, that the original family operated as a unit with interests that were not aligned with hers regardless of how reasonable Elijah appeared in a parlor conversation. Elena held her ground. She had made the deal. It stood. Elijah, operating now in the open rather than from the shadows, provided the education that the situation required. He explained the original family with the measured precision of someone navigating a subject that was both ancient history and deeply personal. There were 6 original vampires, he told them, created by his mother Esther 1,000 years ago in the New World, turned to protect the family from the werewolves that surrounded them. His father Mikhail, himself, Klaus, whose full name was Niklaus, the eldest and most powerful, and the reason for the curse that had been driving events for 5 centuries, Rebecca, Finn, Cole, a family that had survived a millennium through a combination of power and the particular dysfunction that immortality imposed on people who could not escape each other. Klaus was different from the others in a way that the family had spent 1,000 years managing the consequences of. He was a hybrid, born of a werewolf father and a vampire mother, his nature containing both lineages. When Esther turned the family, she had placed a curse on Klaus's werewolf side, suppressing it, locking it away, ensuring that he existed as vampire only and never as the hybrid his bloodline entitled him to be. The reason for this suppression was a secret Elijah did not share fully, even now. But its effect had been to create in Klaus a specific and permanent rage, a wound that 1,000 years had not healed, and that breaking the hybrid curse was intended to address. This was what the Moonstone and the Doppelganger and the werewolf and the vampire components of the ritual were for. To break the curse Esther had placed on her son, to unlock the hybrid nature that had been sealed away for a millennium. Jules arrived in Mystic Falls carrying Mason Lockwood's absence like an accusation. She was a werewolf, part of a pack that Mason had been connected to, and she had come following the trail of his disappearance with the focused determination of someone who already suspected what she would find and intended to make the people responsible understand that consequences moved in multiple directions. She was not wrong about what had happened to Mason. She found her confirmation quickly enough through sources in the supernatural community that had their own channels of information, and the confirmation did what confirmations of that kind always did. She went after Damon. The attack came on a night when the Salvatore brothers were managing the ongoing complications of their situation with a bottle of bourbon and the specific, exhausted tension that had become the default atmosphere of the boarding house. Jules did not come alone. She had made contact with the remaining tomb vampires, had found common cause in the shared project of making Damon Salvatore's evening significantly worse than it had begun, and the assault on the boarding house had the quality of a coordinated action rather than an emotional response planned and timed and executed with the efficiency of people who had agreed on an outcome in advance. Rose was in the house when it happened. She fought alongside Damon and Stefan with the competence of someone who had survived 5 centuries of exactly this kind of situation, moving through the chaos of the attack with the fluid economy of deeply practiced violence. She was effective. She was also, in the confusion of multiple simultaneous threats and the particular darkness of a Virginia night in winter, bitten. Jules's teeth found Rose's shoulder in a moment when the werewolf's trajectory and Rose's position aligned in the worst possible way, and the bite happened before either of them fully registered it. Jules pulled back. Rose pressed her hand to the wound. The fight continued and eventually resolved, the attackers retreating with enough losses to make continuing non-viable, and the boarding house returned to a damaged quiet. The werewolf bite was small. It did not look, in the immediate aftermath, like the most significant thing that had happened that night. It was. Rose's deterioration began within hours, which was faster than werewolf bites typically progressed, a fact that suggested either the particular potency of Jules's venom or the specific vulnerability of Rose's system after centuries of accumulated stress. The fever arrived first, the body's response to something it recognized as catastrophically wrong and could not address with any tool available to it. Then the confusion, the way the fever began to affect her cognition, creating gaps in her continuity of thought, moments where the present dissolved into something else, some other time, some other place that was vivid and immediate in a way the actual present was not. Damon sat with her. This was not, on its surface, surprising. The boarding house was where she was, and Damon was there. But the way he sat with her, the quality of his attention, the specific care he brought to the hours of her deterioration, said something about Damon Salvatore. that he would not have said in words about himself. Rose had been, briefly and genuinely, someone he valued. Not with the operatic intensity of his century-long obsession with Catherine, not with the complicated tenderness that had been building toward Elena. Something quieter and more honest, the simple human fact of having let someone matter. Rose as hallucinated. In the fever's deepest currents, she moved through memories that had the texture of the present, walked through centuries of her own life with the disorientation of someone who could not locate the seam between then and now. She spoke to people who were not in the room, responded to situations that had resolved decades or centuries before. Damon sat beside her through all of it, his voice a steady presence at the edge of her confusion, not correcting, not redirecting, simply there. He took her somewhere green when the end was close. This detail was not incidental. Damon chose a sun-warmed field outside of town, carried Rose there in the early morning light, laid her in the grass where the ordinary beauty of a winter morning in Virginia was the last thing she would see, rather than the ceiling of a room that smelled like illness and old wood. He sat beside her, and he held her hand, and he let her believe, in the final haze of the fever, that she was somewhere safe and warm, that the running was over, that she had arrived somewhere that would hold her. Then he gave her peace, the particular mercy of ending suffering before it ran its full terrible course, the kind of thing that required both love and resolve, and the willingness to carry the weight of having done it. He was alone in the field for a long time afterward. Eleanor found him later that day, back in the boarding house, sitting in the study with a glass he wasn't drinking from, and an expression he wasn't managing. She sat across from him in silence for a while, because silence was sometimes what the situation asked for, and Elena had learned to distinguish the silence that wanted filling from the silence that wanted company. Damon said eventually that Rose had not deserved it, that she had spent 500 years running from a mistake someone else had made her complicit in, and that she had died because of a fight she had no personal stake in, a war that had been waiting for them all when they arrived in Mystic Falls and would keep collecting its payments regardless of what any of them did or chose. Elena said that she was sorry. Damon looked at her with the expression he kept for moments when her genuine kindness arrived without warning, and he didn't have time to deflect it. Then he looked away, and the moment passed, and they sat together in the study while the winter afternoon light moved across the floor and the house settled around them with the quiet of a place that had held too much history to be disturbed by any single loss. The deal with Elijah held. Klaus was coming, and the people of Mystic Falls continued the work of preparing for something they could not stop and could only hope to survive. John Gilbert had a particular talent for arriving at the worst possible moment and making it worse. He had returned to Mystic Falls in the aftermath of the Founders' Day disaster, with his missing fingers wrapped in clean bandages and his anti-vampire agenda intact, which was perhaps the most John Gilbert thing imaginable. The refusal to let a near-fatal stabbing interrupt a crusade. He had survived Catherine's visit to his kitchen through the protection of his Gilbert ring, had awoken in the hospital to find the town in the specific quiet chaos that followed supernatural incidents too large to fully conceal, and had set about inserting himself into the situation with the confident authority of someone who believed his presence was essential regardless of whether anyone had asked for it. Eleanor's feelings about John Gilbert occupied a complicated territory that she had not yet finished mapping. He was her biological father, a fact she had processed in the preceding months without arriving at anything resembling resolution. He had not raised her, had not chosen to claim her, had watched her grow up from a careful distance while her adoptive parents built the life he had declined to be part of. The knowledge of this sat in Elena's chest as something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but contained elements of both. The particular emotional compound that formed when love and abandonment existed in the same history. John's protectiveness of Elena was genuine. This was the thing that made him difficult to simply dismiss. The fact that underneath the anti-vampire rhetoric and the council politics and the various manipulations he deployed as naturally as breathing, there was a real and poorly expressed devotion to the daughter he had never properly claimed. He wanted her safe. He wanted her human. He wanted the supernatural world to release its hold on her with a ferocity that expressed itself almost entirely as interference rather than warmth, as action rather than presence, as the imposition of his judgment over hers on every question that mattered to her. His relationship with the Mystic Falls Founders Council was the instrument of his agenda. The council existed as the town's human infrastructure for managing supernatural threats, a network of founding family members who knew the truth about Mystic Falls and applied that knowledge through the mechanisms of civic authority, the sheriff's office, the historical society, the various levers of a small town's institutional life. John had history with the council, had shaped its direction in the years before Eleanor's senior year, and he returned to it now with the particular energy of someone who believed the organization had gone soft in his absence and required recalibration. His primary target was the Salvatore brothers, whose continued presence in Mystic Falls he found intolerable on principle and increasingly intolerable in practice as Stefan's relationship with Elena deepened and Damon's complicated orbit around her became harder to characterize as purely adversarial. John wanted them gone. He worked the council toward this end with the patient incrementalism of someone who understood institutional processes and was willing to use them. Alaric Saltzman occupied the uncomfortable position of someone who shared John's antipathy towards certain vampires and disagreed with nearly everything about how John expressed it. Alaric had come to Mystic Falls to investigate the death of his wife Isabel, had discovered the supernatural world in the process, had become entangled with the Salvatores and with Eleanor in ways that had gradually shifted him from antagonist to something closer to a reluctant guardian. He was Jeremy's history teacher. He was Elena's unofficial adult ally in a household that had been without adequate adult supervision since the Gilbert's death. He was also, in the fact that the universe appeared to have arranged for its own amusement, the ex-husband of Elena's biological mother. Isabel Fleming had been a mythology researcher, fascinated by the supernatural world, convinced of its existence in the years before she had proof of it. She had gone looking for vampires with the single-minded intensity of someone whose intellectual obsession had consumed everything else: her marriage, her stability, her judgment. She had found what she was looking for. She had asked Damon to turn her, which he had done, and she had disappeared into the supernatural world and left Alaric to grieve a disappearance that wasn't quite death and wasn't quite abandonment, but contained the worst elements of both. Isabel returned to Mystic Falls in the spring of Eleanor's junior year, and her return made John's look subtle by comparison. She was beautiful in the cold, specific way that certain vampires were beautiful, the warmth entirely removed, the human architecture of her face preserved, but emptied of what had made it a face rather than a mask. She moved through Mystic Falls with the ease of someone who had no emotional investment in the reactions she provoked, who had filed the town and the people in it under a category that did not require her to feel anything about them. She was working for Klaus. This information arrived with the particular weight of a revelation that explained too many things simultaneously. Isabel's return was not coincidence, and it was not sentiment. She had come to Mystic Falls as an instrument of Klaus's preparation to clear obstacles, deliver messages, and ensure that the pieces of the sacrifice ritual were moving toward the correct positions. She had aligned herself with an original hybrid's agenda, with the complete conviction of someone who had decided that power was the only organizing principle that mattered, and had followed that decision to its logical conclusion. She used Alaric as her first instrument. She compelled him. She sat across from the man who had loved her, who had built years of grief around her absence, who had come to this town because of what her disappearance had done to him, and she reached into his mind with vampire compulsion and redirected it. Alaric became, without his knowledge or consent, an extension of Isabel's agenda, carrying out actions in the gaps of his own awareness, waking to find himself in places he hadn't chosen to go, having conversations he couldn't fully account for. When Elena found out, the anger was clean and total. Isabel had taken the man who had become a genuine presence in her life, who had chosen to stay in Mystic Falls long after his original reason for being there had resolved, and had turned him into an instrument. It was the same gesture Catherine had made with Caroline. The same logic applied. The demonstration that the people Eleanor loved were not safe from being used as messages or weapons by those with the power and inclination to use them. Eleanor met Isabel directly. This was itself a remarkable fact. The daughter requesting audience with the biological mother who had given her away, in a context where the mother in question was a vampire working for the most dangerous being anyone in Mystic Falls had ever encountered. Elena came to the meeting with the steadiness that had been building in her all year, the compound of grief and determination, and the slowly accumulated knowledge that passivity was its own kind of danger. Isabel's message, delivered with the emotional detachment of someone reciting instructions rather than communicating with a person, was simple. Eleanor should stop fighting. She should stop surrounding herself with people willing to die for her and accept that the sacrifice was coming, and that resistance was not a strategy. It was a delay with casualties. Klaus was patient. Klaus had been patient for 500 years. He would wait out every plan and counterplan and desperate intervention, and the people Elena loved would keep paying the price of that waiting. Elena listened to all of it and said nothing that indicated she intended to comply. She understood the message. She disagreed with its conclusion. What happened next was not something Elena had anticipated or prepared for. Isabel removed her daylight ring. She did it there in the open space of the Mystic Falls, town square, in the thin spring sunlight that filtered through the budding trees, with Eleanor watching and Alaric standing nearby, and the ordinary life of the town moving around them in its ordinary rhythms. She removed the ring from her finger and held it for a moment, and then she let it go, and the sunlight found her immediately with the specificity of something that had been waiting, and Isabel Fleming burned. She was gone in seconds. The speed of it was both merciful and brutal, the completeness of vampire combustion leaving almost nothing. The person and the 500 things she might have said or done or chosen differently simply absent from the world between one breath and the next. Alaric made a sound that Elena did not have words for. Not grief exactly, or not only grief, because grief required the loss of something that had been fully present, and Isabel had not been fully present for years. It was something older and more complicated, the specific wound of watchings, something that had already ended long ago in every way except finally. John Gilbert had watched Isabel die with an expression that Elena had never seen on his face before. The face he wore when something was costing him more than he was willing to show, and the cost was winning anyway. Whatever John felt about Isabel, whatever history had existed between them before Mystic Falls, before Elena, before the decisions that had shaped all three of their lives, it was present in his face in that moment without the armor he usually wore over it. He found Eleanor later that day, and the conversation they had was the most honest exchange they had managed since she had learned who he was to her. He did not apologize exactly, because John Gilbert did not move naturally in the direction of apology. But he said things that functioned as apology, that carried its weight without its precise shape. He said he had always watched over her. From the distance, that was all he had allowed himself. Eckhart said that Isabel had believed, and perhaps he had too, that Eleanor's best chance at a safe and ordinary life required their absence from it. He said that he was aware this belief had served their convenience as much as her welfare, and that the awareness of that had been its own kind of punishment across the years. Eleanor listened. She did not forgive him in that conversation, because forgiveness was not a thing that happened in a single exchange, especially not after a lifetime of accumulated absence. But she heard him, and the hearing was its own kind of movement, however small, in a direction neither of them had been able to find before. Jeremy moved through the spring semester carrying the weight of everything the Gilbert ring had done to him. He had been killed by it twice now, resurrected twice, the ring performing its protective function with the reliability it had been designed for. What no one had fully reckoned with was what the repeated deaths were doing to the mind they were preserving. Jeremy was having experiences at the edges of his awareness, presences and perceptions that didn't have ordinary explanations. The boundaries between himself and something else growing more permeable with each resurrection, the ring performed. He did not tell Elena. He was protecting her in the specific way that people who love each other protect each other from difficult truths, which is to say imperfectly and at cost to himself. The spring deepened around Mystic Falls, and the town moved toward its inevitable appointment with the sacrifice, the pieces assembling with the patient geometry of something that had been in motion for 500 years and was finally approaching its destination. John Gilbert wrote things in a notebook that he kept in his jacket pocket. Alaric recovered his own mind in pieces as Isabel's compulsion faded with her death, reassembling his recent weeks with the disorientation of someone reading a story they don't remember writing. And Eleanor, Gilbert moved through it all with the particular quality of a person who has looked at what is coming and decided that looking away is not available to her, who has chosen presence over denial even when presence is the harder thing. She was learning that spring the difference between acceptance and surrender. They felt similar from the outside. From the inside, they were nothing alike. Bulgaria, 1490. The village existed in the way that villages existed in that part of the world in that century, as a collection of lives shaped entirely by the rhythms of agriculture and family and the authority of the church, contained within boundaries that most of its inhabitants would never cross in either direction. It was not a small life by the standards available to it. It had its own textures and its own pleasures and its own particular beauty, the kind that belongs to places that have not yet been asked to be anything other than what they are. Katerina Petrova was 17 years old, the daughter of a respectable family with enough standing to matter within the village's hierarchy and enough ambition to want more. She was clever in a way that the world she inhabited had limited use for, her mind moving faster than the structures around her were designed to accommodate, her curiosity extending past the edges of what a girl in that place and time was expected to be curious about. She was also, in the way of young people who have not yet learned the full cost of their own choices, impulsive in ways that her family would spend the rest of their relationship with her paying for. She became pregnant. The father was not someone her family would have chosen, the relationship not one they had sanctioned. The entire situation a deviation from the careful social arithmetic her parents had been performing on her behalf, since she was old enough to be considered a prospect for marriage. The pregnancy was a disaster in the specific, practical, irreversible way that such things were disasters in 15th century Bulgaria, not a personal failing that could be absorbed and recovered from, but a social catastrophe that threatened the family's standing and required a response that was both immediate and final. The baby was taken from her the same day it was born. Katerina held her daughter for a matter of minutes, long enough to understand what she was losing, and not long enough to do anything about losing it. And then the child was gone, given away to circumstances Katerina was never fully informed about, removed from her life with the brisk efficiency of people managing a problem. Her family looked at her afterward with the expression of people who have performed an unpleasant duty and expect gratitude for having performed it cleanly. Katerina did not feel grateful. She felt the thing that lives underneath grief when grief has been imposed, rather than simply arrived, the specific and lasting wound of loss that was also someone else's decision. She was cast out shortly after. The social damage of the pregnancy, even managed as it had been, was sufficient to make her continued presence in the family's household a liability that outweighed whatever affection her parents held for her. She was sent away with enough resources to travel and insufficient resources to feel secure, pointed toward England and the vague promise of distant relatives who might take her in. released into a world that was considerably larger and considerably more dangerous than the village she had spent her entire life in. She arrived in England in 1492, and the world she found there was nothing like the one she had left. English society in the late 15th century had its own hierarchies and its own cruelties and its own particular beauty, richer and more complex than anything Katerina had encountered, full of people who wore their power in ways that the village had never taught her to read. She adapted with a speed that surprised her, discovering in herself a facility for performance, for reading rooms and adjusting her presentation to what each situation required, for becoming whoever she needed to be in order to be accepted by whoever was doing the accepting. She was good at survival. She did not yet know this was a talent that would define the next 500 years. She met Klaus and Elijah at a gathering hosted by one of the English noble families whose social calendar contained the kind of glittering events that a young woman of uncertain provenance could access through sufficient charm and the right introduction. They were beautiful in the way that she would later understand was specific to original vampires, a beauty that exceeded the ordinary parameters of human attractiveness by enough to be perceptible without being immediately explicable. Klaus looked at her with the particular recognition of someone seeing a face he had been searching for, and Katerina felt the attention of it without understanding what it meant. She had been looked at appreciatively before. This was different, more specific, as though she were being identified rather than admired. Elijah was warmer, more careful, his manner carrying the consideration of someone who understood something about the situation that he was not yet prepared to share, and was managing the space between his knowledge and her ignorance with deliberate gentleness. He spoke to her with genuine interest in what she said, which was itself unusual enough in that social context to be notable. She spent time in their company over the following weeks. She was drawn to them in a way she found difficult to account for rationally, a gravitational pull that she attributed, in the absence of better explanation, to the obvious fact of their wealth and status and the doors their company opened. Then Elijah told her the truth. He chose a quiet evening, a private conversation in a room away from the social noise of the house they were visiting, and he told her what she was. He told her about the Petrova bloodline and the doppelganger, about the original woman from whom her bloodline descended, about the curse that required a doppelganger's blood, and specifically a human doppelganger's blood to break. He told her with the care of someone who was aware that the information was devastating and had decided that she deserved to receive it from someone who was not indifferent to that devastation. Klaus needed her blood. The ritual required her death. She had been born, as far as the curse's ancient mechanics were concerned, for this single purpose, and the fact that she had thoughts and desires and a history of loss and a daughter somewhere in Bulgaria, whom she would never know, meant nothing to the machinery that had created her. Katerina sat with this information in the quiet room and felt something move through her that she would spend the next 500 years expressing in various forms. It was not despair exactly. It was rage, the clean and total fury of someone who has been told that their existence has been defined without their consent, that they are an instrument rather than a person, that the world has made decisions about them, that they were never consulted about and cannot appeal. She had already had her daughter taken from her without her consent. She was not going to allow her life to be taken the same way. Trevor found her in a state of barely contained panic, moving through the house with the specific urgency of someone calculating escape routes. Trevor, whose sympathy for distressed people was his most consistent characteristic across several centuries, responded to her desperation with the impulsive generosity that was both his best quality and the source of nearly every major catastrophe in his long life. He told her there was a way out. He told her he could help her disappear, get her away from Klaus before the ritual could be performed, give her the chance to run that the last 500 years would never have happened without. She asked him how. He told her what vampire blood could do, that if she had it in her system and then died, she would wake. She would be in transition, would face the choice between completing the transformation or dying permanently, but she would have the choice, and a vampire could not be used in the sacrifice ritual. The doppelganger had to be human, had to bleed human blood. If she turned herself, if she chose to become something other than human, she would be useless to Klaus for his ritual. She would also be hunted by him for eternity. This was not a small consideration. Trevor made sure she understood what she was choosing. That escape from the immediate danger did not mean safety. That Klaus's response to her evasion would be pursuit without limit or patience. That she was trading one kind of impossible situation for another. Rose gave Katerina her blood. She did this for Trevor. Because Rose did most things for Trevor, because their bond had already been forming across the years of their acquaintance, and she was not yet capable of refusing him something when he asked with that particular expression. She pressed her wrist to Katerina's mouth and gave her the vampire blood, and felt, even in that moment, the unease of someone who understands they are making a consequential decision and is not entirely certain it is the right one. Katerina Petrova hanged herself in her room that night. She used a length of cloth and the beam above her bed, and she chose it with the deliberateness of someone executing a plan rather than surrendering to despair. She had wept first, briefly, for the life she was leaving, and the daughter she would never know, and the person she might have been in a world that had not decided her blood was more valuable than her existence. Then she had stopped weeping and done what needed to be done. She woke in transition with the vampire blood, doing what it was designed to do, her body caught between states requiring completion. She found a villager, a young man who had the misfortune of proximity, and she fed, and the transformation completed, and Katerina Petrova stepped out of the room in which she had died as something that Klaus could no longer use. Klaus's response was the one Trevor had warned her about, and that she had agreed to accept as the price of survival. He went to Bulgaria. He found her family, her parents and her siblings, and the extended network of people connected to the Petrova name, and he killed them. All of them. Every person whose existence represented a connection to the girl who had escaped him. Every life that might have given her a reason to stay connected to a human past ended in a single night of methodical destruction. Katerina learned about her family's deaths weeks later, from a distance she could not close because returning to Bulgaria meant returning to Klaus's reach. She received the news in the specific way that news received too late and from too far away was received as a fact that the mind acknowledged before the heart could fully process, a truth that arrived in the understanding before it arrived in the body. She had chosen her survival over the lives of everyone she came from. This was the arithmetic of the decision she had made, laid bare. She had not known, when she chose to run, that this would be the cost, but she had known that Klaus's anger would find expression somewhere, and she had run anyway, and the expression had found her family. She became Catherine Pierce over the following years and decades, the Bulgarian girl buried progressively deeper beneath the accumulated layers of a woman constructed entirely for survival. Catherine Pierce had no family to lose because Katerina Petrova had already lost all of hers. Catherine Pierce felt nothing about the past because Katerina Petrova had sealed the past behind a door that survival required her never to open. Catherine Pierce was charming and cruel and absolutely without sentimentality, because sentiment was the thing that had left Katerina Petrova vulnerable, and vulnerability was something she had decided, at 17 years old, in a room with a length of cloth and a beam, to eliminate from herself entirely. She visited Elena in the spring, in the Salvatore boarding house, at a moment when the distance between them felt less absolute than it usually did. She came without obvious agenda, which was itself unusual enough to be worth noting, and she sat across from the girl who wore her face, and she spoke with a candor that she deployed so rarely, it had almost the quality of a foreign language. She told Elena about Bulgaria. Not all of it, not the daughter, not yet, but the shape of it. The girl she had been before England and before Klaus, and before the 500 years of running. She told it with the detachment of someone describing events that happened to a person they used to know. The emotional content compressed behind the narrative distance of long habit. Elena listened with the full attention that she brought to things that mattered. She was learning something here, something about the road that led from Katerina Petrova to Catherine Pierce, about what 500 years of survival cost and how the payment changed the person making it. She asked Catherine if she regretted it, running, choosing herself over the sacrifice. Catherine was quiet for long enough that the silence became its own kind of answer. Then she said that regret required believing that another choice had been genuinely available, that there had been some version of those events in which Katerina Petrova walked willingly into Klaus's ritual and died, and that death had been acceptable. She did not believe that version had existed. She believed she had done the only thing she was capable of doing, which was choosing to survive, and that the difference between that choice and cowardice was a question for people with the luxury of safety. Elena said that she was not going to make the same choice, that she was not going to run, that she had made a deal with Elijah and intended to honor it, and that the people she loved were going to survive because she was going to find a way to make that happen, rather than purchasing her own survival by abandoning them. Catherine looked at her with an expression that moved through several things in quick succession, something that might have been contempt, and then something that might have been recognition, and then something that neither of them acknowledged because acknowledging it would have required Catherine to admit something about herself that she had spent 5 centuries refusing to examine. She left without saying whether she thought Elena was brave or foolish. Perhaps she didn't know. Perhaps after 500 years of choosing survival above everything else, the distinction had become genuinely difficult to locate. Elena sat alone in the boarding house after Catherine left and thought about the girl in Bulgaria who had been told her life belonged to an ancient curse and had decided it belonged to herself instead. She understood that choice, understood it with the specific comprehension of someone facing the same question from a different angle. She did not judge Katerina Petrova for running, but she was not going to run. She was going to find another way through, even if the finding cost her everything. Because the people gathered around her in this town, the ones who had chosen to stand between her and the darkness at every turn, deserved better than to be left behind by someone who had decided her own life was worth more than theirs. Katerina Petrova had been alone when she made her choice. That, Elena thought, might have been the difference, not courage or its absence, simply whether you were alone when the moment arrived, or whether you had people beside you who made the arithmetic come out differently. Elena was not alone, and that changed everything. Klaus arrived in Mystic Falls wearing Alaric Saltzman's face. This was the first horror of his arrival, before the second and the third and all the ones that followed. He had possessed Alaric through a witch's spell, a transference of consciousness that left Alaric's body inhabited by something 1,000 years older and immeasurably more dangerous, while Alaric himself was displaced, aware but unreachable, present somewhere behind his own eyes without access to his own hands. The people who knew Alaric noticed the wrongness immediately, the way the familiar architecture of someone's presence changes when the person behind it has been replaced. The cadence was different. The stillness was different. The eyes held something that Alaric's eyes had never held, an ancient and absolute authority that made ordinary rooms feel smaller. Klaus moved through Mystic Falls in Alaric's body with the unhurried confidence of someone who had arrived at a destination after a very long journey and had no interest in pretending the journey had been anything other than exactly what it was. He reacquainted himself with the geography of the town, assessed the players he had been receiving reports about for months, and made his presence known to the Salvatore brothers with the casual ease of someone dropping in on acquaintances rather than announcing himself to the people who had been building defenses against him. He compelled Jenna. He did this early, before the formal machinery of the sacrifice was assembled, using Jenna as an instrument of information and access in the same way Isabel had used Alaric. The pattern of taking someone's nearest and most trusted and turning them into a conduit repeating itself with the pitiless consistency of a lesson being taught to someone who had not yet learned it. Jenna moved through the Gilbert house in the days before the ritual with the specific vacancy of a person whose conscious cooperation has been bypassed, doing what she was directed to do without understanding why she was doing it. Elena found out, and the knowledge landed with the full weight of everything she had been afraid of since making her deal with Elijah. The people closest to her were the most accessible targets. The sacrifice's approach was not a thing happening at a distance. It was already inside her house, already wearing the face of the woman who had raised her since her parents died, and there was no space left between Elena and the event horizon of what was coming. Klaus left Alaric's body when his own was ready to receive him. His true form arriving in Mystic Falls was a different kind of horror from the possession, less disorienting, but more absolute. He was beautiful in the way the most dangerous things were sometimes beautiful. The external presentation refined across a millennium into something that operated as its own kind of weapon, drawing the eye and disarming the instinct to flee in the fraction of a second before the instinct reasserted itself. He was tall and composed, and spoke with an accent that carried the ghost of a dozen languages beneath the one he was currently using. 1,000 years of displacement condensed into the rhythm of ordinary sentences. He looked at Helena with the specific satisfaction of someone who's been searching for a thing across 5 centuries and has finally located it exactly where they expected it to be. Bonnie had been preparing for weeks with a desperation that she wore quietly, carrying it in the dark circles beneath her eyes and the slight tremor in her hands when she thought no one was watching. She had found the spell, had found the source of power that might make it workable, had found the terrible arithmetic of what it would cost. 100 dead witches existed in the history of the Bennett line. 100 women of power who had died across the centuries and whose collective energy was theoretically accessible to a living Bennett witch willing to pay the price of channeling it. The price was her life. Channeling that much power through a human body was not survivable. Bonnie had done the calculations and arrived at the same answer every time, and she had decided, with the quiet certainty that she brought to all her most important decisions, that this was acceptable. Elena would live. That was the only outcome Bonnie was designing for. Elena found out about this plan in the days before the ritual, and the argument that followed had the quality of 2 people who loved each other completely and disagreed about something fundamental to how that love should be expressed. Elena told Bonnie she would not allow it, would not permit her best friend to die in order to save her, that the entire premise of Bonnie's plan violated a thing Elena had been trying to build all year, which was a way through the sacrifice that did not require the people she loved to die for her. Bonnie told her that some decisions were not Elena's to make. They were both right. They were both wrong. They stood in the space between their respective rightnesses and looked at each other with the specific grief of people who understood that love sometimes expressed itself as the willingness to do terrible things, and that neither of them could fully condemn the other for it. John Gilbert found Elena the night before the sacrifice. He came to her in the kitchen, which was where the Gilbert family had always conducted its most consequential conversations, the room that held the most ordinary memories, and was therefore the room where extraordinary things landed with the most contrast. He sat across from her and he looked at her with the expression he wore when the armor was down, not often and not for long, but genuinely down. He told her he had been working with Bonnie on something, a spell, old and specific and requiring a particular kind of sacrifice that he had been thinking about since the moment he understood what the ritual required. He told her that there was a way to link his life force to hers, to use his mortality as a counterweight to her death, so that when the ritual claimed her, his life would pull her back. She would die, the curse would break, and the tether of his life connected to hers would draw her consciousness back into her body before the death became permanent. He would die in her place, permanently, his life force exhausted in the act of returning hers. Eleanor stared at him across the kitchen table and felt something shift in the complicated territory of her feelings about John Gilbert, the slow geological movement of something that had been fixed for a long time finding a new position. She told him she couldn't ask him to do this. He told her she wasn't asking. He told her about choosing, about the ways the people who loved her had been choosing her since Grayson Gilbert had told a stranger at a Wickery bridge to save her first. And he said that he wanted to be part of that, wanted to have made one choice about her that was entirely right and entirely unambiguous. He told her she was extraordinary. He told her the doppelganger was the least interesting thing about her. Eleanor said goodbye to Jeremy in the afternoon before the ritual. Jeremy, who had grown into someone the Gilbert parents would have been proud of despite everything, who had survived his own harrowing path through the supernatural world and come out the other side with something hard and real in him that was not bitterness, even though it had every right to be. She held her little brother and felt the full weight of what she was walking toward, the possibility that the plan would fail, that the tether would not hold, that this was the last time. Jeremy did not let her go immediately. He held on with the specific grip of someone who understood the arithmetic of the moment and refused to pretend otherwise. Stefan came to her before she left for the ritual site. He stood in the doorway of her room with a particular expression he wore when he was managing something very large and very painful with everything he had. And he said the things that needed to be said without decoration or delay. He told her he loved her. He told her he was going to make sure she came through this. He told her that Elijah's deal would hold because he was going to make absolutely certain it held, and that she needed to trust him and trust the plan, and trust that the people around her were capable of protecting what mattered. Then he told her about the other thing he was considering, the offer he was preparing to make to Klaus if the variables shifted and the plan required an adjustment. And Eleanor's response to this information was immediate and absolute. She told him no. Stefan's expression did not change in the way of someone conceding a point. It changed in the way of someone who has already made a decision and is allowing the person they love to believe they have influenced it out of compassion. She understood this later. Not yet. The ritual site was a clearing on the old Lockwood property, a space that had been used for supernatural purposes across generations, the ground holding the memory of old magic in the specific way that places did when they had been touched by it repeatedly. Torches burned in a circle that Klaus had arranged with the methodical precision of someone executing a design, the flames throwing light that moved in the breeze coming off the Virginia hills. The air had the quality of the night before a thunderstorm, pressurized and charged, the atmosphere responding to the proximity of old magic preparing to move. Jenna was there. She wasn't there as a participant who had chosen to be present. She was there because Klaus had turned her, hours before the ritual, without her consent and without preparation, forcing the transition in the rapid and brutal way that stripped away every choice available to a new vampire. Jenna Summers, who had been Elena's guardian, who had given up the life she had been, living to raise her sister's children, who had tried for years to be enough, despite understanding that she was not designed for the role and doing it anyway, had been made into the second vampire component of Klaus's ritual by a process she had not understood until it was already done. She looked at Elena across the clearing with the expression of someone trying to communicate something enormous through the barrier of compulsion and fear. Elena looked back at her and understood everything that Jenna's expression contained: the apology, the love, the terror at what she had become and what was about to be done to her, and the desperate need to make Elena understand that none of this was her fault. Elena had been told by Elijah, by Stefan, by Damon in his own way, by everyone with any knowledge of how this ritual worked, that Jenna would not survive it. The vampire component of the sacrifice did not survive. This had been the non-negotiable element of the ritual's requirements, the piece that no amount of planning or deal-making had found a way around. Jenna was going to die. Elena was going to watch. Tyler was at the edge of the clearing, restrained by compulsion, his body already beginning the involuntary responses of a transformation he had not chosen to initiate on this particular night. He looked at Caroline, who was standing further back, also present, also compelled, also having the specific experience of being a supernatural being, whose agency had been suspended by something older and stronger. Their eyes met across the clearing with the particular communication of people who have been through something together that has no ordinary language. Klaus moved through the ritual stages with the focus of someone performing a ceremony they have been rehearsing for 500 years, because that was precisely what he was doing. He was not hurried. He was not agitated. He was a 1,000-year-old hybrid conducting the procedure that would restore what had been taken from him, and the scale of his patience was visible in every unhurried movement. He killed Jenna first. He did it quickly, efficiently, the stake finding her heart with a precision that suggested he was minimizing the duration rather than extending it. It did not feel quick from where Elena was standing. It felt like watching the world lose something irreplaceable between one breath and the next, like the specific violence of a door closing on a room you will never enter again. Jenna's face in the final second held the expression that Elena would carry for the rest of her life. Not fear, but something past fear, a kind of acceptance that had found its way through terror to a place that was quieter and more absolute. She was gone. The first component of the ritual satisfied. Tyler's death was next, his neck broken with a speed that made it almost merciful, his werewolf healing already beginning its work. The moment the damage was done, he would come back. The curse ensured that the werewolf nature binding him to resurrection, as long as the cause was supernatural. He would wake in pain and transformation and the terrible knowledge of what had occurred. But he would wake. Caroline was next in Klaus's calculation, the second vampire the ritual required. Stefan stepped out of the darkness. He had made his offer before Elena could stop him, before anyone could intervene, moving into the space between Klaus's intention and Caroline's life, with the quiet deliberateness of a man who has thought carefully about a sacrifice and decided it is the right one. He offered Klaus 10 years of servitude, of being whatever Klaus needed him to be, the Ripper unrestrained, the vampire who had spent over a century building control agreeing to abandon it in service of something monstrous, because Caroline Forbes was standing in that clearing, and she was not going to die if Stefan Salvatore could prevent it. Klaus looked at Stefan with the assessment of someone calculating value, a ripper in his service, a vampire of Stefan's history and capability, and the particular usefulness of someone whose moral collapse would be complete and thorough once the switch was engaged. He agreed. The calculation satisfied him. Elena's scream was muffled by the compulsion Klaus had placed on her. Her voice, not entirely stolen but reduced. The sound she made when Stefan agreed to his own destruction compressed into something smaller than it deserved to be. She looked at Stefan across the clearing, and he looked back at her with the expression he wore when he was certain, and the certainty was costing him everything, and he was paying it anyway. Klaus came to her then, and the ritual's final stage began. The blade was small. This was one of the details that stayed with Elena afterward. The way the instrument of something so enormous was physically so modest, an ordinary knife made significant only by the magic loaded into the act of using it. Klaus drew it across her throat with the clinical efficiency of someone performing a procedure, and Elena felt the sharp sting of it, and then the warmth of her own blood. And the world began to narrow at the edges in the way the world narrowed when the body understood it was losing something it could not afford to lose. She thought of her parents. She thought of Jenna. She thought of Stefan's face across the clearing, and Damon somewhere beyond the ritual circle, and Jeremy at home, who did not know what was happening and would wake to a changed world. She thought of John Gilbert sitting at the kitchen table telling her she was extraordinary, and she thought about what it meant to be loved by people who were willing to die for you, and whether you could carry that and still stay upright. The world went dark, not suddenly, not violently. Gradually, the way light diminished at the end of a day, the edges softening first and then the center. And Elena Gilbert died in a clearing in Virginia on a spring night, while an ancient curse cracked open above her and remade the supernatural world. Bonnie Bennett released a spell. She channeled the 100 dead witches of the Bennett line, and the power moved through her like a river finding a break in a dam. Enormous and immediate, her body the only available channel for something it was not built to contain. She was aiming for Klaus, targeting the power at the hybrid whose death might interrupt the ritual's completion, or at least extract a cost from the evening proportionate to what it had taken. She hit him with everything the spell contained, and Klaus staggered. And for a moment that had the quality of held breath. It seemed possible that the plan would work, that Bonnie's sacrifice would purchase something definitive. Elijah was there. He moved toward Klaus with the specific intention that Eleanor had trusted him to act on, the deal that she had staked everything on, the promise that Elijah's word was the kind that held. His hand found Klaus's shoulder, and the moment arrived when 500 years of family history and 1,000 years of obligation would resolve into a single choice about which of those things weighed more. Klaus spoke to him. What he said, in those few seconds, involved the truth about their family, about the other originals who were not dead as Elijah had been told, but preserved, daggered and stored, their continued existence dependent on Klaus's continued goodwill. Elijah had believed his family gone, had been carrying that grief alongside everything else, and the revelation that they were alive and accessible and findable hit him with a force that rewrote the calculation he had arrived at the clearing prepared to complete. He did not kill Klaus. He helped him escape instead, moving them both out of the circle before Bonnie's power could finish what it had started, making a choice that honored the family he had thought he'd lost over the deal he had made with a 17-year-old girl. Eleanor had told him she trusted his word. Damon was the one who found John Gilbert. The spell had done its work, the tether holding, and Elena's body in the clearing took a breath and then another, the consciousness returning by increments, the warmth of life following closely behind. John was found nearby, the life drained from him in the specific and complete way of a man who had given everything available to give, his face in death carrying the peace of someone who had finally done the right thing after a long time of doing the wrong ones. Elena woke on the ground with the spring air on her face and the sound of the people she loved around her, and the specific grief of someone who has survived something that cost other people everything. Jenna was gone. John was gone. Stefan was gone, already departed with Klaus. The 10 years of servitude beginning immediately, the price paid and irreversible. She lay on the grass and looked at the sky above Mystic Falls, and understood that surviving was not the same as winning, that the ritual's end was not the story's end, that the morning she was waking toward would require her to stand up and continue in a world that had been reshaped by the night's events in ways she had not yet fully accounted for. But she was alive, and John Gilbert had made sure of that in the kitchen, across a table, in the only language of love he had ever been able to speak to her, which was action rather than presence and sacrifice, rather than the ordinary daily work of being a father. She was alive. That was what he had bought with everything he had. She intended to use it. The morning after the sacrifice had the particular quality of mornings that follow catastrophic events. The way the world insisted on continuing its ordinary operations regardless of what had occurred within it. The sun rose over Mystic Falls with the indifference of a thing that did not track human loss. Birds moved through the air. The town began its daily rhythms, and Eleanor Gilbert sat in the Gilbert House kitchen and understood that she was going to have to find a way to exist inside all of that normalcy while carrying what the previous night had left her with. Jenna was dead. John was dead. Stefan was gone. These three facts had different textures, different weights, different ways of arriving in the consciousness when the mind moved toward them. Jenna's death was the one that hit the deepest and most immediately, because Jenna had been family in the most daily and present sense, the person who had been physically there, who had made breakfast and forgotten to buy groceries and tried so hard to fill a role that had been too large for her and had filled it anyway through sheer determination and love. She had been turned and killed in the same night, her vampire existence lasting only hours, long enough to feel the fear of transformation and not long enough to find any footing in it. She had died confused and frightened and loving Elena, and Elena was going to carry the specific knowledge of that for the rest of her life. John's death arrived differently. There was grief in it, genuine and surprising in its depth given the complicated history between them, the years of absence and the months of difficult presence, and the single conversation in a kitchen that had finally said the things that needed saying. John had not been her father in any of the daily ways that mattered. He had been her father in one way, completely and without reservation, and that one way had saved her life. And the grief of losing him contained the additional grief of all the time they had not had, all the conversations they would not now be able to have, the relationship that had just begun to find its real shape and had been ended before it could become what it might have been. Stefan's absence was a different kind of loss, not death, but disappearance, not an ending, but a suspension. The person she loved removed from her life and placed into something she could not follow him into. He was with Klaus. He was doing what Klaus required of him. The 10 years of servitude that he had offered in Caroline's place. The Ripper that Klaus had agreed to accept as a substitution. Damon had explained to Elena what that meant, had told her with the blunt honesty that was his particular form of kindness, what Stefan's servitude looked like in practice, what turning off his humanity at Klaus's direction would do to the person he had spent over 160 years building. Elena received this information and filed it alongside everything else she was carrying and made the decision that she was going to get him back. She did not announce this decision. She did not frame it as a plan or present it with specifics. She simply made it in the quiet of her own understanding, and it became one of the things that organized her days in the weeks that followed. Jeremy needed her. This was the most immediate practical fact of the aftermath, the thing that required her attention before anything else, because Jeremy had lost Jenna too, and he had lost John, his uncle, and in ways he was still processing his half-uncle, and he was doing what Jeremy did with grief, which was to compress it into something small and dense and carry it in a place where it was not visible to anyone who wasn't looking closely. Elena looked closely. She had always looked closely at Jeremy, had been watching him since the night their parents died, and the watching had become something essential to how she organized herself in the world. She found him in his room the morning after, sitting on the edge of his bed with his hands between his knees and his face doing nothing at all. The specific blankness that followed emotional events too large for immediate processing. She sat beside him without speaking. They remained like that for a long time. The Gilbert siblings in a house that had lost another layer of its inhabiting presences. The rooms around them holding the absence of people who had been present in them recently enough that their absence was still shaped like them. Alaric was there. He had been there through the night, and he remained through the morning, moving through the house with the quiet usefulness of someone who understood that the most important thing he could offer in the immediate aftermath was competent presence rather than comfort. He made coffee. He answered the door when people came. He sat with Jeremy when Eleanor needed to be somewhere else, and with Elena when Jeremy needed to be alone. He was not family technically, had no formal claim on the Gilbert household, but he had been present in their lives with a consistency that formal claims could not have improved on. The funerals required planning. This was a particular cruelty of grief's practical dimension, the way the most painful period of loss was also the most administratively demanding. The decisions about location and timing and who to notify and how to explain deaths that could not be explain truthfully to anyone outside the supernatural world's awareness. Jenna Summers and John Gilbert were buried 3 days after the sacrifice, side by side in the Mystic Falls Cemetery, in a ceremony that was small and honest, and did not attempt to make either death into anything other than what it was, which was too soon and too much. Eleanor stood at the graveside between Jeremy and Alaric and felt the specific weight of being the person these losses had converged around. The awareness that both of them had died in direct relation to her existence, to what she was and what that had required. The guilt of this was not a new sensation. She had been carrying versions of it since Wickery Bridge, since the first night the supernatural world had claimed her family as part of the cost of her survival. But it had a new depth now, a new layer added by the specific mechanism of John's death, the deliberate and chosen nature of it, the letter in his handwriting that she had read so many times in the preceding days that she had memorized it without intending to. He had signed it as her father, not as John Gilbert, not as the man who had failed her, as her father. She kept the letter in the drawer of her bedside table, and she did not speak about it to anyone for a long time. Damon was sick. This was the fact that arrived in the days following the sacrifice with the quiet insistence of something that could not be deferred, that required immediate attention regardless of what else was happening. The werewolf bite Jules had inflicted during the attack on the Salvatore boarding house weeks earlier had been suppressed, managed by Damon's vampire healing into something subclinical, present but not progressing. In the aftermath of the sacrifice, with the supernatural landscape of Mystic Falls rearranged and the stress of the preceding weeks compounded by the ritual's events, the bite reasserted itself. The fever came first. Elena arrived at the boarding house to find Damon in a state she had never seen him in. The invulnerability he wore as a fundamental feature of his existence compromised in a way that made him look, for the first time since she had known him, genuinely fragile. The fever was high and climbing, his vampire body fighting something it was not equipped to fight, the werewolf venom operating through his system with the patient destructiveness that made it lethal in ways that most supernatural threats were not. The hallucinations followed. Damon moved in and out of coherence with a disorientation that was disturbing precisely because it was so foreign to him. The sharp-edged awareness that was his primary instrument of survival softened into something unfocused, the world around him unreliable in ways it had never been before. He spoke to people who were not in the room. He was sometimes, in other times, other years, the past and present bleeding into each other through the fever's distorting medium. He hallucinated Catherine as Elena, or Elena as Catherine. The confusion moved in both directions. The faces he had been carrying in different chambers of himself for over a century and a half superimposed in the fever's blurring. The girl who had made him a vampire, and the girl who had remade him into something that resembled a person with conscience, collapsed into a single presence that the fever addressed with the complicated devotion of someone who had loved badly and long, and was only now, in his most reduced state, unable to maintain the careful distinctions he usually kept. Elena sat with him through the worst of it. She brought blood bags and cold cloths, and the particular quality of presence that she had developed across a year of sitting with people through difficult things the ability to be genuinely there without requiring anything of the moment. She heard what Damon said in the fever, and she did not repeat it afterward, did not use it, did not bring it into their ordinary interaction as evidence of something she had extracted from him while he was too compromised to guard himself. She held it as the private thing it was. She was not unaffected by it. But this was not the time for that accounting. Stefan reached them through a channel they had not expected. He was with Klaus somewhere in the southeast of the country, the hybrid's movements following a pattern that suggested purpose without yet revealing its full shape. Stefan managed to communicate through an intermediary, a vampire with loose connections to the Salvatore network, a message that was brief and specific. Klaus's blood could cure a werewolf bite. The hybrid's blood, administered to a vampire suffering from werewolf venom, would neutralize the poison and restore health. It was the only known cure for something that had previously been considered uniformly fatal. The obtaining of it required negotiation with Klaus, which was itself a particular kind of horror. The necessity of going to the thing that had destroyed so much and asking it for a favor. Stefan managed this from within the terms of his servitude, using the access his arrangement provided, extracting the concession in a way that cost him something Elena was not fully informed about and did not attempt to fully determine. The blood arrived. Damon recovered. He woke from the fever's final depths into ordinary consciousness with the specific disorientation of someone returning from a very long distance, taking stock of where he was and what had happened, and the fact that he was alive, which had not been the certain outcome for several days. He found Elena sitting in the chair across from his bed, and he looked at her with an expression that contained a number of things he did not immediately arrange into words. He told her she should have let him die. He said this not with self-pity, but with the particular logic of someone who had spent a long time believing his own existence was a net negative and had recently accumulated evidence against that position without having fully revised the belief. Elena told him with the directness that had become her default register that she had no interest in his self-destructive reasoning and that he was not allowed to die, and that if he made another argument in that direction, she would make the next several days very unpleasant for him. Something in his face shifted at this, the specific movement of a person surprised by care expressed as stubbornness, which was perhaps the form of care best suited to receive. Tyler left Mystic Falls in the weeks following the sacrifice, quietly and without extensive farewell. He told Caroline, because Caroline was the person he told things to now, the one person whose knowledge of what he was made ordinary concealment unnecessary. He told her he needed to go, needed to be somewhere that was not this town, with its accumulated weight of supernatural obligation and the specific guilt of having been the werewolf component of a ritual that had killed Jenna Summers. He needed to find other werewolves, needed to understand what he was in a context larger than Mystic Falls, needed to build some kind of relationship with his nature that was not purely defined by its most catastrophic expression. Caroline listened to all of this and heard what he was not saying, which was that leaving was the only way he could think of to begin recovering from the night in the clearing, and that recovery felt necessary before he could be present to anyone in any useful way. She did not argue against this reasoning. She helped him pack, which was the most Caroline Forbes thing imaginable. The channeling of emotion into practical assistance. The love expressed as organization. She watched him drive away from the Lockwood estate with the expression of someone who had decided to feel what the moment asked for and not compress it into something more manageable. Tyler Lockwood had come to her for help on a night when he had no one else, and she had stayed in a cellar while he became a wolf, and something real had grown from that. Something she did not yet have the right name for but was not willing to pretend was smaller than it was. Matt knew something was wrong. He had known for months, had felt the distance in Caroline. The places she was absent from conversations she was physically present in. The things she wasn't telling him accumulating until the shape of them was more present than anything she was sharing. He was perceptive in the quiet way of people who express their intelligence through attention rather than articulation, and he had been paying attention to Caroline Forbes since they were children, which meant he noticed things that someone less familiar would have missed entirely. Caroline told him the truth in June, which was either very brave or very overdue, depending on the measure applied. She told him everything: the transformation, the vampire nature, the years she had spent learning to exist inside a body that operated on different rules than the one she had been born with. She told him with the directness of someone who had decided that the relationship either survived the truth or it didn't, but that continuing to maintain the lie was no longer something she was capable of. Matt processed this with the specific difficulty of someone whose framework for the world had just been expanded without his consent. He was not prepared for it. He did not handle it with grace in the immediate period, said things that were hurtful in the specific way that fear expressed as rejection was hurtful, retreated into the silence of someone who needed time that Caroline deserved to be given. They did not end cleanly. They ended the way things ended when one person had become something genuinely new, and the other person was still standing in the version of the relationship that had existed before the newness, unable to find the bridge between those two positions. Caroline grieved the relationship without letting the grief become a verdict on herself. She had learned in the preceding year to distinguish between the pain of loss and the meaning assigned to that pain, and she was careful not to let Matt's inability to accept what she had become translate into a conclusion about whether what she had become was acceptable. These were separate questions. She held them separately. Bonnie and Jeremy found each other in the aftermath, the way people found each other when they had survived something together that couldn't be fully shared with anyone who hadn't been present for it. Bonnie had not died. The 100 witches channeled through her having stopped short of the threshold that would have made the sacrifice complete, but she had been closer to that threshold than anyone had known in the moment, and the experience had left marks that she carried quietly. Jeremy had watched everything from a distance that felt both protective and intolerable. The distance of someone kept from the center of events for reasons that were reasonable and felt insufficient. They were careful with each other in the way of people who recognize something real and were afraid of what recognizing it meant. The witches had warned Bonnie about the cost of a relationship between a witch and a hunter, had spoken of consequences that extended beyond the two people involved. Bonnie carried this warning with the seriousness she brought to all supernatural information. The understanding that the world she inhabited had its own rules, and that those rules did not make exceptions for the desires of individuals, however genuine. She cared about Jeremy anyway. She could not, it turned out, make herself not care about him on the basis of a warning, however credible. This was perhaps the most human thing about Bonnie Bennett, the practitioner of ancient magic, the channeler of 100 dead witches, the girl who had been willing to die for her best friend. She was still capable of being moved by ordinary feeling in spite of everything that had shown her how expensive ordinary feeling could become. Eleanor wrote in her journal through all of it. She wrote about Jenna and John and the specific texture of grief for people whose loss contained so much that had been unfinished. She wrote about Stefan and what it meant to love someone who had chosen to save someone else, and to be grateful for that choice and devastated by it simultaneously. She wrote about Damon, about the week of sitting beside his bed, about what she had heard in the fever and what she was doing with having heard it. She wrote about the summer ahead, about the shape of what it required. She were going to find Stefan. She was going to bring him back from whatever Klaus had made him into, was going to reach past the compulsion and the turned off humanity and find the person she knew was underneath. She did not know yet how she would do this. She knew only that it was the next necessary thing, the obligation that the sacrifice had handed her, along with the life it had preserved. She had survived again. The people around her had paid for that survival again, and the only response she could find that was adequate to what they had given was to make it mean something, to take the life that John Gilbert had purchased with his own, and Jenna Summers had been sacrificed to preserve, and Bonnie had nearly died channeling, and Stefan had 3,650 days of servitude to maintain, and to live it with the full force of what those costs demanded. She closed her journal in the late evening and sat at her desk and looked out the window at the Mystic Falls summer dark, and she began, in the quiet of her own determination, to plan. And so the second chapter of Mystic Falls closes, not with resolution exactly, but with the particular quiet that follows a storm that has passed through and taken things with it. Season 2 was never a story about winning. It was a story about cost, about what ancient forces extract from ordinary lives when they move through them, about the specific courage required to keep standing when the ground keeps shifting beneath you. Catherine Pierce ran from her fate 500 years ago and built a life from the running. Every cruelty a survival strategy, every betrayal a war between herself and the girl in Bulgaria who had her daughter taken away and was told her blood was worth more than her choices. She survived. She is still surviving. And the question she leaves behind her, the one that follows her through every room she exits, is whether survival purchased at that price is still recognizable as a life. Elena Gilbert was given the same question and answered it differently. She stood in a clearing in Virginia and let the ritual take what it required, because the people she loved were worth more to her than the running. She died and came back and woke in a world that had paid an enormous price for her continued presence in it, and she chose to honor that price by remaining fully present, fully herself, fully human in every way that mattered, even as the supernatural world kept asking her to become something else. Caroline Forbes learned that transformation does not have to mean diminishment, that you can become something you never asked to be and still choose every single day what that thing does with its existence. She became a vampire against her will and responded by becoming the most deliberately compassionate version of herself available, refusing to let what was done to her determine what she did in return. Tyler Lockwood learned that the curse you carry is not the whole of your story, that the body can become something frightening, and that the person inside it can still choose kindness, can still seek connection, can still find in their most monstrous hour someone willing to stay in the room. Bonnie Bennett carried the weight of being the person everyone counted on and chose again and again to keep carrying it, not because she had no other option, but because she had looked at the people she loved and decided they were worth the weight. And Stefan Salvatore walked away from his own life to preserve someone else's, which was perhaps the most Stefan Salvatore thing he had ever done, the distillation of everything that had made Elena love him, the choice that broke her heart and confirmed everything she had believed about who he was. This season asked everyone in Mystic Falls the same fundamental question, dressed in different costumes. What will you give up to protect the people you love? And the answers were all different, and all costly, and all entirely in keeping with who each of these people had always been underneath everything the supernatural world had layered on top of them. The curse is broken now. Klaus has his hybrid nature. The ancient machinery that had been running since 1513 has completed its cycle and gone quiet. And the people left standing in the aftermath are standing because of each other, because of the specific and irreplaceable network of love and loyalty and stubbornness that held them together through everything the year demanded. So rest now, gentle dreamer. Let the images settle, the torchlight fading, the clearing returning to ordinary dark, the town of Mystic Falls quiet under its summer stars, the people in it sleeping, grieving, planning, loving, continuing in the way that people continued after impossible things, because continuing was what they did, because the alternative was surrendering to the darkness, and none of them were willing to do that. You have traveled through a full year of their lives tonight, through loss and transformation and ancient curses and the particular stubborn grace of people who chose each other over and over in a world that kept giving them reasons not to. Let that carry you now into your own rest, your own quiet. Breathe slowly. Let the story settle into something warm and finished behind your eyes, and sleep, knowing that the people of Mystic Falls will be there when you return, still standing, still choosing each other, still holding on. Good night.